Do you actually have a real driver's license, or did you borrow it just to show off?" the white police officer hissed through his teeth, his eyes filled with suspicion as he pulled over a black woman in plain clothes. He had no idea that this woman was a colonel in the United States Army, someone who had commanded more than 100 life or meth missions in the Middle East. A stupid, prejudiced question became the spark that ignited a counterstrike powerful enough to shake the entire system. When the truth doesn't need to scream but only to be seen, whose side are you on? Where do you live? In a place where silence is a fake shield, or where justice still dares to breathe? Told me. It was a familiar federal road stretching across the quiet countryside of the American South, where signs reading "Drive safely, God is watching" hung between church flags and gas stations that only opened during daylight hours. Wind slid along both sides of the highway, sweeping past dry fields and wooden utility poles faded by weather. A scorching noon, nothing unusual, until a black Lexus with mirrored windows rolled slowly through a deserted turn. The car wasn't speeding, didn't break any laws, and showed no obvious signs of suspicion. But for Mark Delroy, a 38-year-old patrol officer sitting in his Ford Interceptor just a few hundred meters away, it was an anomaly too obvious to ignore. Not because it was fancy, not because of the speed, but because of the person behind the wheel. A black woman, short-cropped hair, a non-branded shirt, and a posture too upright for his mental image of someone casually driving a Lexus. Mark hit the patrol light switch, the siren blared sharply. The Lexus immediately pulled over. Not in a rush, not hesitating, as if the driver had already anticipated the situation. He stepped out of his car, right hand adjusting his gun belt, left hand resting on his flashlight, like it was a required opening act in a ritual of intimidation. His footsteps echoed crisply on the hot asphalt, each stride measured, as if walking toward someone who needed to be put in their place, not toward a citizen. He tapped on the car window, not too hard, but far from polite. Then bent down, eyes scanning the interior like he was hunting for something suspicious. The woman in the car didn't react immediately. She didn't roll the window down right away. She lifted her head, looked straight ahead, breathing steadily, hands fixed at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, exactly as taught in driver training. That composure irritated him. Guilty people usually rush to apologize. Innocent ones often showed fear, but she did neither. She just looked at him, not with contempt, not avoidance, not expectation, just a gaze cold as a well-maintained, never-fired weapon. Mark paused for a second, a very short second, just enough for him to realize he was the one being examined, not the other way around. Then he growled, "That car doesn't look like yours. Borrowed? Or stolen?" A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Not humor, but the satisfaction of someone thinking he had the upper hand. Camille Hightower rolled the window down. She said nothing. No expression. Her face betrayed no reaction, not because it was blank, but because it was accustomed to the kind of probing question that pretends to inquire, but is loaded with judgment. That face, not angry, not tired, was one any black woman who had ever sat behind the wheel of a car she rightfully owned would recognize. She didn't respond with words. She simply held her gaze, neither fiery nor submissive. Mark clicked his tongue. He straightened up, eyes darting down to the license plate. Old tag, crookedly placed, no brand frame, no club decal, just a plain set of numbers. But to him, imperfection was cause for suspicion. Registration? License? He snapped, as if she had made him wait 30 minutes, not 3 seconds. Camille remained silent. Her right hand left the wheel, pulled out her wallet, produced her license and registration, and handed them over without delay. He took them, scanned her name, then looked back at her. "Camille Hightower. That last name rings a bell. Or maybe not. What do you do?" It wasn't a question. It was a test. She stayed silent. He frowned, tilted his head. "Are you deaf? Or just think you're above the law?" Still no response. Camille raised her left eyebrows slightly, a very subtle, clearly controlled gesture, then turned her gaze toward the far side of the road, where a deer crossing sign stood. In that instant, Mark almost felt invisible, a sensation no other driver had ever made him feel. He clenched his jaw, took a step back, flashlight still in hand. "Step out of the car. "I want to check the trunk." She didn't resist, nor did she comply eagerly. She just unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out. Her walk was steady, like a soldier leaving formation, every footfall deliberate, evenly spaced, her shoulders not dropping even a fraction. He opened the trunk, shone his light, and checked loosely but enough to imply dominance. Nothing suspicious. An emergency bag, a pair of running shoes, a bottle of water, a few folders and a binder. All meticulously clean, almost offensively so. He grabbed one folder, flipped through it. Preliminary documents marked confidential, organization name visible, but no job title listed. He rolled his eye. "What's this? You work for the government? Probably just another useless community project." She still didn't respond. Every word he said bounced off like glass. Not because she didn't understand, but because she chose not to engage with ignorance. Mark was truly getting irritated. Not because she insulted him, but because she refused to play the game. She gave him no excuse to escalate, no attitude, no resistance for him to latch onto. But to him, her calmness was a form of defiance. He lowered his voice, made it cold. "I've seen your kind before. Quiet, not because of manners, but because you think you're better than the law. I smell weed, or maybe just arrogance." The last line was both a cheap metaphor and a baseless provocation, but in his kind of system, sometimes that's all it took to start trouble. Camille turned back to face him. Still no words, but now her eyes were no longer neutral. There was a shift, not fear, not anger, but a clinical detachment, the kind a doctor shows when looking at a terminal diagnosis they've already made peace with. He stepped back, not out of fear, but because he realized this woman wasn't being inspected. She was observing him unravel. The wind blew across the road again. The flashlight in his hand caught the sun, reflecting off the Lexus windshield like a blade turning against its wielder. No one spoke for 15 seconds, but in that silence, the system had already been laid bare, and the scalpel wasn't in the hands of power. The breeze brushed lightly against the back of Camille's shirt as she stood next to the Lexus, like a still boulder amid the shimmering heat rising from the asphalt. Mark Delroy watched her from behind the still-open trunk, not to inspect, but to prolong the illusion that he was in control. But he was wrong, and he knew it. He just didn't dare to admit it yet. What unsettled him most wasn't her silence. It was that the silence carried no scent of fear. It wasn't the kind of silence he was used to from people worried about ending up on a report. Not the stiffness of someone preparing to argue or explain, and certainly not the submission of someone trying to talk their way out. It was a complete stillness, the kind honed by someone too familiar with imposed power to bother reacting anymore, a sharp kind of numbness, and for someone like Mark, accustomed to managing with discomfort and judgment, this was an unspoken challenge he didn't know how to interpret. He stepped forward a few paces, now standing face to face with her. His shadow stretched across the pavement, just enough to cover the tip of Camille's shoes. He growled, this time no longer indirectly, "You're making me uncomfortable. You understand that? I'm not asking to be ignored. I'm asking because I have doubts." He pointed to the road behind the car. "Do you know why I pulled you over? Because you're driving this car on a road that wasn't built for people like you." A short pause. Then he emphasized each word like the sound itself was a form of accusation. "Not for people like you." Camille didn't turn her head. She still looked off into the distance, but this time her lower lip tightened slightly, a minuscule movement at the corner of her mouth, as if, deep in her mind, a long locked door had just nudged its hinge. But that door didn't open. It just sealed tighter, and behind it every memory was pushed even farther back. Once more, in that distant gaze, there was no pain, only a quiet exhaustion, as if she had heard that sentence, worse variations of it, 100 times before, in different cities, under different badges. But never once had she allowed herself to answer in the language they wanted to drag her down into. Delroy thought he had slapped her pride, but in truth, he had only stepped on the shadow of his own. He turned back to his car, pulled out a pair of rubber gloves, and put them on like a ritual before an unnecessary inspection. No legal justification, no need. just an attempt to invoke that looming feeling of you might be searched. The feeling that made ordinary people turn themselves into suspects simply because fear had been planted. He walked back around, stood beside her, chin tilted toward the back seat. "What's in there? Purse? Backpack? I need to see." Camille opened the back door and gently pulled her handbag forward. A black leather bag, no logo, no flashy color. He took it without asking, unzipped it, and looked inside. A leather notebook, an eyeglass case, a small pouch of medication, and a few personal items, all meticulously arranged. Every item is in its place as if it had passed dozens of security checks. Nothing odd, and that, more than anything, irritated him. He turned to her, still holding the bag. "Do you pass through this road often? Where do you live?" It wasn't a question for confirmation. It was bait, hoping for some slip from the person being examined. But Camille didn't fall for it. She didn't answer, didn't react. She just looked at him, not directly, but as if seeing a reflection of herself in the windshield. Blurred, sun-drenched, and irrelevant. Unable to bear the silence any longer, Mark began to push with words that were legally framed but threatening in tone. "I have the right to detain you if I find probable cause. If you don't cooperate, I can take you to the station for further questioning. You know that, right?" The question was thrown like a psychological swerve, but it never landed. Camille stood exactly as before, unmoved, showing no sign of being cornered. On the contrary, she began to put her wallet away, not to produce more documents, but to retrieve the legality she had just been forced to present like a ticket into a world she should have had access to since birth. Mark looked at her with a mix of frustration and confusion. The way she carried herself and every gesture, so steady, so by the book, left him with no crack to exploit, no excuse to escalate in the usual pattern. There was no rashness to suppress, no raised voice to label as non-compliance. She wasn't falling into the mold of a manageable victim, nor was she turning herself into an object to humiliate. And that was what truly began to gnaw at him, a raw irritation, no longer masked by the legitimacy of his authority. And then, as if to reassert his role as the one in power, he extended a finger toward the open trunk and said through clenched teeth, "You need to remember, on this road I decide who moves forward, and today I'm not sure you have a good enough reason." It wasn't a warning. It was the declaration of someone feeling his footing slip, trying to reclaim it with a line more threatening than lawful. But in that very sentence, Camille tilted her head slightly to the left. For the first time, a clear movement, then looked him straight in the eye, not defiantly, not thankfully, just a gaze, quiet and deep, layered like riverbed stone, where every rebellion had already settled, leaving only the sediment of hardened endurance. He stepped back, not because Camille stepped forward, she hadn't moved, but because that look carried a silent message. "This isn't the first time I've been pulled over, but it might be the first time you've been truly seen." The story had yet to find its conclusion, but in that very brief moment, between wind, insects, and a silence frozen in time, something had become clearer than any license. This road was never drawn for someone like Camille, but today, someone like her would be the reason it must be redrawn. That moment, when Camille's gaze seemed to drift calmly past all the aggression, desperately flailing for something to hold on to, Mark Delroy suddenly felt himself swaying on a kind of authority he had always believed to be absolute. He didn't step back, but something in his body began to shift, a subtle kind of movement only recognizable to those who've faced a presence too steady to control. She didn't challenge him with words, didn't resist with movement, but it was precisely that doing nothing that became a dull blade peeling back the thin skin of his ego. The same ego he'd always used to push others beneath him. He couldn't comprehend. Why would someone being treated like that not respond? Why wasn't there a single word of protest? A sharp glance, a flare of anger to give him a reason to escalate? That calculated silence drove him mad, because it stole from him the only thing he thought he controlled, the script of the confrontation. "Why don't you react?" He blurted the question out. as if unable to bear the silence stretching across the space between them. It wasn't a question meant to be answered. It was a question meant to assign blame. Blame someone who refused to play by the rules of those in uniform, rules built on imposing, intimidating, and then escaping through templated reports. Camille didn't move. She looked into the space between their two vehicles, as if the question wasn't even worth receiving. Not because she disrespected him, but because in the system she knew too well, questions like that were always double-edged. Answer them, and you reinforce the stereotype. Stay silent, and you become the thing the system fears most, a mirror that won't crack. He stepped closer, no longer masking his anger. His hand gripped the edge of her car door, fingers tightening as if to anchor the unrest bubbling inside him. "What are you thinking, huh? You think you're better than me? Think silence gets you out of this? I seen your type. Quiet, direct gaze playing the moral card, and then when they turn around, he let the sentence trail off. Not because he ran out of words, but because he realized there was nothing else to say that wouldn't reveal the tremor hiding beneath his voice. Camille tilted her head slightly, not to meet his eyes, but to look at the sweat slowly blooming on the collar of his shirt. A soft, damp mark that said plainly, the one losing control here wasn't her. And that was the moment Mark realized he could no longer hold the role. No one had told him what to do next. There was no protocol for handling someone who didn't resist but also refused to obey. His mind was blank, a kind of emptiness he had never faced, because until now everyone had done exactly what power had trained them to do: fear, argue, submit, or explode. But Camille didn't. She hadn't stepped out of any role, because she'd never been acting. She was entirely herself, and that was the most dangerous thing he'd ever encountered. His hand tightened around her documents, thumb folding inward as if preparing to tear. But then it stopped. In that instant, something inside him collapsed, not loudly, not dramatically, just a slow descent into the feeling of being completely seen through. Camille, at that point, spoke for the first time. Her voice wasn't loud, held no accusatory tone, and no emphasis was designed to provoke fear. She simply asked, "What are you planning to do next?" A simple question, but like a nail driven straight into the machinery already overheating. Not a threat, just pressure applied exactly where the crack had begun forming, inside the law and order mask of Mark Delroy. He took a step back, didn't answer. Her document still clenched in his hand, but his eyes began darting side to side, as if checking to see if anyone was witnessing this moment. Inside, his anger still churned, but it had no outlet. He was too used to people who feared authority, to the point he forgot some people didn't have to fight it to make it retreat. Camille didn't move. She didn't take the opportunity to seize the upper hand. She remained exactly where she was, like a fixture in the scene, neither advancing nor retreating. And then Mark noticed her wallet, still open on the center console. Through the sunlight slanting across the windshield, he saw an old photograph, slightly faded but clear enough to recognize, a person in uniform, wearing medals, standing among a group of soldiers in a solemn ceremony. The sun reflected off the ID card next to the photo, obscuring part of the text, but the name Hightower was unmistakable, along with a row of military identification numbers beneath it. He looked at that, then looked back at Camille, as if for the first time realizing he knew nothing about the woman in front of him. But instead of backing down or softening, his body stiffened further. His instinct to maintain dominance made him growl one final line, said more like a statement than a threat. "You think I should be scared of you? Think if you just stay quiet, I'll let this slide?" Camille met his gaze directly this time, no longer avoiding it. She answered, not with fury, but with a voice low, firm, and cold as steel. "I don't react. Not because I'm afraid, but because I'm letting you show who you are." In that moment, there was no more wind, no distant car horns, only the tension between two breaths. On one side, a man used to acting to assert control. On the other, a woman long accustomed to enduring without ever bowing. And in the void between them, something was shifting, not between two people, but between a human being and the system they both carried on their backs. A system about to be forced to ask itself, do we still deserve the badge we wear to keep order? Camille's final sentence, cold and calm like a vein of steel running quietly beneath the earth, thickened the air around Delroy as if the atmosphere itself were about to collapse. He didn't know how to respond. No protocol for silence reflected so brutally. No training course had taught him how to confront someone who could unravel his authority without lifting a finger. The rubber gloves on his hands began to burn under the southern sun, but it wasn't the heat that made him sweat. It was a creeping awareness, surfacing for the first time in someone used to standing over others. He was being judged, not by his superiors, but by the person he thought of as the subject under inspection. To escape that feeling, Delroy pulled the radio from his shoulder and pressed the button to call headquarters. He tried to keep his tone even, requesting backup for a suspicious vehicle stop. Highway 17, turnoff number 6. The subject is non-compliant, potentially attempting to evade identity verification. He didn't glance at Camille, but he wanted her to hear it. He wanted her to know that no matter what look she gave him, there was nothing she could do when the whole system stood behind him. That was how men like him armored themselves. Call for backup, escalate, turn a personal moment into a departmental issue, as if the more people watching, the less obvious his failure would become. Within minutes, the familiar sound arrived. A slow patrol engine, a brief siren chirp, a cruiser stopping just behind his. The officer who stepped out was Riley, a young cop, newly assigned to this area for less than 3 months. He was tall, slightly lean, his hair buzzed clean, and he still nodded politely when greeting someone, a habit many veterans had long discarded like an unnecessary accessory. Riley approached, his eyes scanning the scene. A composed black woman standing beside a luxury car, Delroy opposite her, gloves still on, face taut like a strung wire. "What's going on?" Riley asked. Not accusatory, just procedural. Delroy waved a hand dismissively. "Just a non-compliant subject. Help me recheck her documents and verify her ID in the system." Riley stepped forward. Camille had already turned her face toward him, her gaze unchanged, but something in it made Riley pause. Not fear, not strangeness, but a profound familiarity, as if he'd seen that expression before, not in daily life, but in training manuals, in the section about how veterans react when pulled over unlawfully. He accepted the license from Camille, her hand steady, unwavering, and glanced at the name. Camille Hightower. Not a common surname, but not unfamiliar either. Riley tapped the license number into his tablet. The connection lagged slightly, but when the results appeared, he froze. Not just a legal citizen. Not just a clean record. Under the name Camille Hightower appeared a stream of additional data marked in dark blue. A code used for former high-ranking military personnel with files designated internal system access only. Riley looked back at Camille, this time with a different gaze. Not pity, but a cautious reverence. The kind bred into cadets from academy days when instructors spoke of officers who'd led brigade-level units in classified operations. He stepped back, half a pace. "Ma'am, did you serve?" His voice was soft, just above a whisper. Camille didn't confirm or deny. She simply asked, "What do you think?" Riley didn't answer. But something had shifted in his expression. He turned toward Delroy, voice lowering. "Records seem clean. Nothing worth detaining." Delroy frowned. "Just clean? You didn't see anything else?" Riley pressed his lips together. He didn't mention the military classification. Not to conceal it, but because he knew if Delroy saw it, he'd try to weaponize it, not respect it. Delroy stepped forward and snatched the tablet. The words federal clearance, confidential assignment, non-disclosure, special operations appeared plainly beneath Camille's name. He read each word slowly, then turned to look her over, from head to toe for the first time with a hint of hesitation. But that hesitation didn't last, because for men like him, respect doesn't exist unless it serves their authority. "So what are you? A former soldier? Or just some clerk who checked veteran on a form?" He said it without truly expecting a reply. Camille didn't respond. Riley turned slightly, as if to avoid the confrontation, because he knew that if he stayed, He would be forced to choose a side, and for a young officer that was more terrifying than witnessing wrongdoing. Delroy, meanwhile, kept his eyes fixed on the ID card in his hand. Then he said a final line, one Riley would never forget. "The lower ranks know, the higher-ups don't need to. Out here, I still decide who gets to move forward." It sounded like a declaration of authority, but in truth, it was an exposed confession from a man who had just realized he was wrong and was trying to salvage the remnants of a cracking ego. Camilla said nothing more. She extended her hand, not rushed, not expectant, just a clear gesture. "Return my documents." Riley was the one who handed them back. Gently, carefully, the way one returns something tainted by unworthy hands. And in that moment, among the three of them, no one spoke, but a truth had settled unmistakably. Some who wear the uniform are unfit to comprehend, those who once wore it, with blood, sweat, and silence. Camille's hand gently closed her leather wallet, then placed it on the front seat, as if she had just completed the final ritual of patience. In Riley's eyes at that moment, she didn't look like a citizen who had just been checked, but like someone who had delivered a real-life ethics report, one that required no judge or recording device, only an offender arrogant enough to expose himself. But what kept Riley silent wasn't just Camille's composure or the name that appeared in the system. It was the way she held the deepest part of herself, not flaunted, not hinted, but just enough for the person across from her to feel he was standing in the wrong place. He sensed something was about to emerge, not as a threat, but as proof. True authority doesn't need to raise its voice. Delroy still wouldn't let go. He curled his lip and tossed out a sarcastic line he thought sounded sharp, but only exposed his desperation. "Medals, clearance, anyone can forge paperwork. Don't think a few gold-printed lines are going to scare me." Camille didn't react. Instead, she reached into the left pocket of her shirt and pulled out a bifold wallet, smaller than a civilian's, dark blue, edged with steel-tone trim, no brand logo, just a polished piece of leather meticulously preserved. When she opened it, Riley instinctively leaned in. It wasn't just a card. It was a declaration. On the matte blue background was an embossed national seal. In the upper right corner, small letters read, "Department of Defense, United States Armed Forces." In the center, a portrait of Camille, in formal military uniform, the look in the photo no different from the one she wore now, sharp, alert, neither soft nor boastful. Below that, beside the line reading rank, Colonel, was a special security code, listing clearance levels granted only to those who had served in strategic combat environments. Riley stared at the card without blinking, because it carried what he'd heard about in training sessions. A card not meant to show off, but to remind people way they'd crossed a line. Delroy glanced over. He didn't read all the information, but he understood enough. What he was facing was no longer a stubborn black woman, as he had assumed, but a quiet link in a system that he only skimmed the surface of. He scoffed, a reflexive shield just before the illusion of hierarchy slipped. "So, Colonel, you're military, huh? Then why are you driving alone? No driver, no uniform, no entourage. If you're that important, why haven't I seen you in the news?" The line was spoken with mockery, but beneath it, a layer of fear was taking root. Camille looked at him, not to measure but to conclude. To Riley, that look felt like watching someone dismantle a palace using the same bricks it was built with. She spoke, not loudly, but each word landed like a gavel at a hearing. "This card isn't for you to know who I am. It's to remind you not to forget who you're supposed to be." Delroy pressed his lips together, but his hand began to move away from his belt. He was used to giving orders, but now he was being led by the voice of someone he thought he was inspecting. He started to say something, but Camille stepped forward half a pace. Not threateningly, just enough to ensure her words didn't drift off into the wind. "What you wear doesn't place you above me." That line, for Riley, was the most concise ethics lesson he had ever received. Not in a classroom, but right there, on the street. For several seconds, the world around them went completely silent. Riley stepped back, eyes fixed on Delroy for the first time, no longer hiding the fracture splitting inside him. Not because Camille had won, but because he, a younger man, had just witnessed the collapse of a generation he was once told to emulate. Delroy looked from Camille to Riley. He knew that if this moment had been recorded, he wouldn't just lose a public exchange, he'd be judged as a man. But lucky for him, or so he thought, there were no cameras, no witnesses, no viral clips, no hashtags, just the wind, a card, and a silence that made him feel smaller. Camille didn't put the card away immediately. She left it in her left hand, letting Riley take one more look. Then she closed the wallet with no wasted motion. Riley nodded, saying nothing, but within that nod was unmistakable recognition. Not for rank, but for something harder to define. Dignity upheld in the face of humiliation. Delroy, by then, just stood there. He didn't move forward, didn't retreat, like a statue forgotten in a park between seasons. And then, as if to seal all that had transpired, Camille looked at them both and said quietly, "I don't ask to be respected for my past. I just hope not to be dismissed for my silence in the present." Camille's final words landed like a cold full stop under the noon sun, and Riley felt as if something inside him had just been rewritten, not by logic, but by a kind of moral instinct that only awakens when witnessing something right being treated as wrong. When she tucked her card back into place, closed the wallet, and turned her eyes away as if the entire inspection had never occurred, Riley felt the need to know more, not out of curiosity, but from a professional instinct, to reestablish the truth, a truth that clearly his superiors had never even considered, and one he had never been trained to confront. He turned and walked back to his car, opened the control panel, and connected to the federal data system, a portal only accessible to officers with Level 2 clearance. When he entered Camille's military ID number, the sequence he had skimmed from the anti-forgery print on her card, the screen blinked once before flashing a row of warnings. Accessing restricted profile, oversight flag active. Federal clearance level 3 required. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the screen. It was the kind of alert he had never encountered in his service. But strangely, the system didn't lock him out. Instead of blocking access, the screen redirected him to a summary file, not detailed, but enough to make his palms begin to sweat. The file read, Camille E. Hightower, rank Colonel, Ret Branch, United States Army, Special Assignment, Civilian Oversight Liaison, Federal Judiciary Review, Department of Justice. Below it, a red note read, Subject has limited jurisdictional immunity under Executive Directive 14.6a. Riley froze. These terms, properly interpreted in a law enforcement context, meant the woman he had just inspected could oversee officers like himself and Delroy, and had the authority to request a reverse investigation into the entire incident if she detected abuse of power. He swallowed hard. Inside him was not fear, but the jolt of flipping to the last page of a book he hadn't even started. Everything he had just witnessed, the composure, the unwavering gaze, the way Camille held her silence like someone doing the inspecting, not being inspected, now came together into a complete picture. It was no longer a coincidence, no longer luck. She wasn't there by accident. She was there because the system, whether it liked it or not, had walked itself right into the presence of someone capable of looking straight through it. He turned toward Delroy, who now stood at an angle staring into the distance, eyes fixed on some point along the horizon to avoid confronting the loss of dominance. Riley approached him, handed over the tablet. "You should see this." Delroy scanned it, eyes darting through the lines, then scowled. "What the hell is this?" His voice hoarse, as if his throat had just been constricted by the weight of truth. Riley said nothing, only pointing to the line, Federal Judiciary Review, active status. Delroy froze. The name Camille Hightower no longer belonged to someone who could make trouble. It had risen far beyond their reach, to a level where decisions didn't need police permission, but made police reconsider their behavior. Delroy turned toward Camille, for the first time saying nothing. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew that anything now would be redundant. Riley looked at him, not to scold, not to advise, just with the gaze of someone who had witnessed a moral boundary collapse, not by anyone's hand, but by truth. Camille didn't step forward, didn't issue commands, didn't speak again. She remained there, just as still, but everything had shifted. No longer did either man see her as someone who needed to be verified. On the contrary, they were now the ones being evaluated, compared, and reminded. Riley closed the device, placed it back in its holster. Inside him now remained one question, unspoken but clear as a bell. Who is she? But the answer, he realized, wasn't in the file. It wasn't in the rank. And it wasn't in words like special operations or federal. It was in the way a human being could stand still in the storm of prejudice without being swept away, and without needing to prove anything, still make an entire system step back. That was something no computer could display, but the human heart knew. No one asked anything further. No one gave an order. There were no more gestures from the three people standing under the midday sun. Then, as if by an instinctual rhythm never discussed, Riley returned to his vehicle and shut down the system check, while Delroy remained in place, arms hanging loose as if every tendon had just been drained of tension. Camille stood between them, neither stepping forward nor retreating, just tilting her head slightly, as if the only thing left was her chance to end this in her way, not with victory, not with compromise, but with a final word. Something she had withheld not due to a lack of content, but because she waited for the precise moment when the listener had no choice but to listen. Her voice rose, not as a soldier, not as a victim, and certainly not as someone demanding her honor back. It was the voice of a person who understood the value of silence more than anyone who'd ever pleaded for justification. A voice without crackling emphasis, without outrage, without tears, just a stream of water flowing over stone, long enough to carve a canyon, solid enough not to speak too often. "I didn't speak," she said slowly, her gaze sweeping across both men, not avoiding, not threatening, but as direct as a doctor delivering a diagnosis the patient didn't want to hear. "Because I chose not to." The air seemed to tighten. The wind still blew, but its sound now served as background for a sentence both gentle as breath and heavy as a verdict. Riley tilted his head slightly, as if ensuring he wouldn't miss a single word after such a long, breathless silence. "You thought I had nothing to push back with, but I have plenty. I could flash my rank, my record, my authority. I could quote every statute violated in the last 15 minutes. I could request an on-the-spot report and have your name listed in a memo to the Department of Homeland Security by sundown. But I didn't take that path," Camille continued, her tone still calm, unchanged in pace or weight, "because if I did, that would only reinforce what this entire system already fears, that only those with power are treated like people." Delroy remained motionless. He couldn't speak, his eyes fixed on Camille's shoulder, where Rank once sat, now only showing the even fold of a shirt as carefully ironed as a soldier preparing for morning inspection. He thought to say something, but stopped, because even he no longer believed in any words that could rescue his standing in that moment. Camille looked straight at him. Her voice, now softer but no less firm, rang out like the echo inside a wall thought to be soundproofed. "You don't need to know who I am to treat me with decency. What kept me silent wasn't fear of you. It was to see how far you'd go if no one stopped you. And you've gone far enough to understand it yourself." The sentence came with no judgment, no call for punishment, but its weight, precisely because of its poise, hit the ground like the sound of a name etched into stone. Not so that someone would remember, but to remind. Some people were here and made others reflect. Riley clenched his fist, not from tension, but because something inside his chest had knocked once. Hard. He was witnessing a woman who didn't need to raise her voice to silence two men in uniform, not with retaliation, but with an unshakable integrity that didn't need applause. He didn't know what to do in that moment. No manual ever taught young officers how to react when the person mistreated turned out to be the one with the right to judge you. But he knew one thing: today would be a day he wouldn't forget. Not because of the incident, but because of the lesson in character taught by a long silence and closed with a word spoken at the perfect moment. Camille walked back to her car without haste. She opened the door, sat down, and placed her wallet back into the center console. But before shutting the door, she turned, not looking at anyone in particular, toward the space she had just occupied as a living testimony. I chose not to speak because speaking doesn't always make people understand. But when I do speak, I want them to remember. The door closed. The sound was so soft it barely registered. But to Riley, it was the loudest sound he'd heard in all the time he'd worn a badge. Delroy didn't move, didn't retreat. But clearly he had backed down, not with his feet, but in the crumbling of the belief that a badge on his chest was enough to make everyone lower their voice. He now stood in a space between authority and conscience, and for the first time he felt the latter weighed more. But Camille didn't wait to see him change. She didn't need to, because this confrontation from the very beginning was never about winning. The sound of the door closing echoed in a strangely still silence. Not loud, not sharp, but unmistakably a marker, the point dividing the silence of someone who had just said what needed to be said from the silence of those who now had to face the consequences. Inside the car, Camille tilted her head slightly, her left hand adjusting the rearview mirror, not to look behind her, but as an unconscious gesture. A habit forged from thousands of tactical assessments in combat zones where every blind spot could mean a threat. But this time, no threat was coming from behind. Instead, there was a system, one she had prepared in advance, not for defense but for reflection, and that system was already at work. A soft beep came from the dashboard, barely audible unless you were sitting in the driver's seat. A small display under the speedometer lit up for a second and then went dark. No one but Camille knew what it meant, but in that instant, everything that needed to happen had already been done. From the moment Delroy signaled her to pull over to the second he demanded she step out without a lawful reason, the car's internal recording system had been triggered. Not by touch, not by voice, but by an integrated encryption module. Technology only found in vehicles authorized for or supporting strategic intelligence operations. And it didn't just record. Once activated, the system captured all data, including cabin video, internal audio, GPS coordinates, even vocal tone analysis, in real time, and pushed it directly to a specialized cloud server protected by 3 layers of security proxies. Each passing minute generated a snapshot that would self-destruct after 120 seconds if it didn't receive an authentication ping from the primary server. But Camille didn't need confirmation. She didn't need to ensure the data was safe. She had pre-configured the system to send the first extract the moment cabin volume exceeded 78 decibels, a threshold classified as non-interactive disruptive noise. And the critical fact was Delroy's voice. The very first time he barked outside her window exceeded that threshold by nearly 11%. So, before he even asked, "This car doesn't look like yours. Borrowed or stolen?" The entire data sequence had already been transmitted. A copy of the audio, unalterable, irreversible, was now housed in the Law Enforcement Oversight Database within the Oversight Review Group, a division of the Department of Justice, tasked specifically with monitoring officer behavior at critical enforcement checkpoints. Camille didn't speak, not because she didn't need to, but because she knew when the system speaks for you, every word from the other side becomes evidence. Outside, Delroy still stood, head slightly bowed, shoulders slumped, no longer the threatening figure he had tried to project. He had seen the file, seen the name, seen the line, federal clearance, and he had seen Riley's gaze, the look he once assumed would always align with his, now leaning away, no longer support but scrutiny. But what Delroy didn't yet know, and couldn't possibly guess, was that every word he had spoken, every smirk, every condescending phrase, had already become part of an immutable data set, a data set that required no lawsuit, no commentary. Its mere existence was enough to shake the foundations of an internal review. Riley hadn't left his car. He sat still behind the wheel, staring into the empty road ahead, but in his mind everything was spinning. He had seen Camille Hightower's name in the internal database, understood who she was. He had witnessed how she wielded silence like a weapon, and now all that remained was the final inevitability, the thing everyone in the profession feared most, that something had been recorded and would be used at a moment no one could predict. A soft ting came from Riley's phone. A secure message from the internal police system, automatically generated by behavioral incident software, once it detected disproportionate engagement inconsistent with the personal identity record. The message didn't elaborate, only said flagged, oversight node triggered contact supervisor. Riley didn't respond immediately, but he knew this only happened when a serious discrepancy was logged between an officer's conduct and the subject's registered profile, and once flagged as triggered, the data was already being routed through the emergency review pipeline. Camille remained seated in the car, eyes on the speedometer, not checking her phone, not touching the wheel. She knew exactly what was unfolding, but she needed no confirmation. What had to be sent was sent. What needed to be seen would be seen, and what must be held accountable would be forced to face accountability, not by argument, but by the cold precision of numbers and uncut recordings. Elroy finally moved. He turned his head, glanced toward the Lexus, then turned away and walked back to his cruiser. No swagger, no gloves, no forceful door slams, only silence stretched across each step. He didn't know that each of those steps was now logged by technology he couldn't access inside a system whose name he didn't even know. And the cruelest truth was this: no one had to push him down. All it took was letting him continue walking the exact path he chose from the beginning. Camille started the engine. No revving, no rush. Just a soft ignition, enough for the motor to hum like a quiet reminder. She still controlled everything, even the exit. And this time, as the Lexus rolled away from the roadside, there were no sirens, no barriers, no questions. She didn't have to say anything more, because now everything had already been said, before the other side even realized they weren't in charge. The encrypted alert passed through 3 layers of private networks and appeared on an internal server of the Department of Justice at 2:36 in the afternoon, Eastern Time. It was an automated signal, requiring no sender, addressed to no recipient, identified only by the tag OVR17 and flag crank crit, a code that rarely surfaced, and when it did, it usually led to no fewer than 3 closed-door federal-level meetings. Within 40 minutes, the recording, including images, extracted coordinates, vocal heat maps, and prior behavioral files of both involved officers, had been compiled into a narrative alert log report spanning 37 pages. That report was printed into 6 hard copies and placed on the table of a meeting room belonging to the Office of Behavioral Oversight for Federal Law Enforcement, located on the 9th floor, Building C, within the Interagency Security Complex in D.C. There were 8 people in the room, 6 printed copies, 1 projection screen, and a silence no one dared break with small talk. On the screen was a frozen frame, the woman in the photo stepping out of her car, both hands relaxed at her sides, her eyes looking straight into the front camera, as if she knew exactly she was being filmed. Yet no one in the room uttered her name, not because they didn't know. They had read the files. They had reviewed the attached appendices. They knew every mission she had led, every rank she had held, every commendation recorded by 3 sitting presidents, including a handwritten note that read, "Her silence speaks like thunder." But in that room, where each attendee represented one system overseeing another, no one wanted to be the first to say the name Camille Hightower. In the hallway, an officer from the Internal Liaison Unit, not yet 30, eyes still lit with the eagerness of someone not yet crushed by the machine, accidentally dropped a stack of files. Among them was a printed photo from the arrest, captured from a body cam, freezing the exact moment a white officer extended his arm and slapped a black woman sitting in her car, hands still on the steering wheel, offering no resistance. A passing technician caught a glimpse of the image, muttered, "Which idiot thought it was smart to pull that on Camille Hightower's daughter?" and burst into laughter. But the laughter didn't last, because when everyone in the hallway turned around, the only expression they wore was one and the same: contempt. The perpetrator, the officer named Delroy, was under administrative detention. In the isolation unit designated for special-level federal personnel, he was not issued a uniform, not allowed to share a table with anyone, and when he passed through the dining area, an older female FBI agent set her tray down, tapped her fingers on the table edge, and said loudly enough for the room to hear, "Humiliate a soldier's daughter? Around here, that's treason." He stood up, his face drained of all color. But before he could leave, a janitorial staff member tossed him a dirty, torn hand towel, not to use, but to remind him that from now on, no one saw him as human anymore. At the oversight office, when the playback reached the girl's scream, a short but sharp sentence, "I am the daughter of Colonel Camille Hightower," the entire room muted the audio simultaneously, without any command. One among them, the head of behavioral analysis, a veteran of Fallujah, closed his eyes briefly and adjusted his belt, as if recentering his stance. He had heard that voice before, not the girl's but the mother's, during mortar fire raining down on Bravo 9 camp 10 years ago. That memory alone was enough for him to say a sentence he had never voiced in over 20 years of service. "Let's pray she's just angry, because if she decides to respond, this won't be an investigation anymore." Another agent, head of internal legal affairs, proposed an immediate suspension of all of Delroy's operational duties and called for the seizure of all his personal and service-issued weapons. The proposal was approved in under 17 seconds. No objections, no debate, and when the screen switched to the third camera angle, showing Camille Hightower gently placing her hand on her daughter's shoulder before leaving the scene, a senior advisor from the Department of Homeland Security murmured under his breath, "That is not an ordinary mother. That is a warning bell for the entire system." But in that room, where everyone represented a system overseeing another system, no one wanted to be the first to say the name Camille Hightower. Instead, they used her case ID, 927BA. A silver-haired man, representing the military, tapped his finger on the folder in front of him without looking up. 927BA was previously assigned strategic coordination duties with the DOJ during the pilot phase of proactive behavioral monitoring. She held the authority to collect, encrypt, and transmit data without the approval of field enforcement officers. That authority remained valid through the end of this quarter. The sentence was delivered with the cold clarity of a verdict read without a jury, and when he, the one named in the report, heard that line through the secure audio feed from the adjacent room, his eyes twitched as if each word was extracting blood from his skin with a needle's tip. He tried to sit upright, but his fingers gripped the edge of the chair until they turned white, knowing full well he wasn't just under watch. He was being systematically purged like a defective unit on an automated assembly line. White woman, representing the Federal Office of Administrative Procedure Review, turned to page 17 of the printout and spoke. The final statement, the line, "You've gone far enough to know it yourself," was flagged by AI as carrying exceptional moral weight, with an emotional impact score surpassing 9.3 on the nonviolent behavioral scale. No one laughed, no one looked surprised. But 3 corridors away, where Delroy sat awaiting his preliminary review, a young security officer inadvertently left the radio volume up just as the analysis replayed. Everyone present, from janitorial staff to internal investigators, turned their heads simultaneously toward him. No one said a word, but someone pulled out their phone to snap a photo. Not to post, but to record proof that they had witnessed a man standing in the center of a moral collapse. He grabbed the radio, smashed it to the ground, and looked around pleadingly, but the only response he got was a cup of coffee splashing across his shoes and a voice enunciating each word, You think you're still worthy of hearing about moral reasoning. They simply kept taking notes, as if witnessing an earthquake whose epicenter was a person who had chosen silence through nearly the entire event. Another participant, a representative of military justice, spoke up, this time not reading from any document but looking directly at the group across the table. The issue does not lie with her. The issue is this. The system operated exactly as designed, but the one caught in violation was part of the very force that was meant to be monitored. The statement rang out in the thick air, and in a nearby breakout room, the lead technician quietly removed Delroy's staff credentials from the access system. Rather than issuing an official notice, he simply sent an email titled "Revoked" with a blank hyperlink. Where once there had been a full operational history of Delroy, now there appeared only one line of text. This credential no longer exists. No one was notified. No announcement was necessary. All it would take was for him to sit at a terminal, input his personnel code, and face the cold truth that he had never truly existed as a legitimate part of the system. Silence again. No objections, no rebuttals. In that room, the most terrifying thing was not the audio recording. It was the fact that someone who should have been protected by a title had to use that very title as a shield. Camille had not spoken to be heard. She had stayed silent long enough for the system to hear itself. At a cafe near headquarters, where lower-level staff often gathered during breaks, the incident had become the primary flavor of Tuesday afternoon espresso. One person grimaced, setting down an early print of the newspaper and pointing at Delroy's photo with a look of disgust. How much was that slap worth? A career? A life? Or was it just the price you pay when you think the system is your personal lapdog? Everyone nodded, and in that moment the entire event, originally classified as top secret, had leaked without documents, without press, but through contempt that spread with the speed of social instinct. A young assistant, the only one under 30 in the room, cautiously asked, "Should we invite her to the upcoming internal review session?" Everyone looked at him. There was no scolding glare, but neither was there support. After a few seconds, the chair, a senior official who had served under 4 different secretaries, shook his head. "No, we don't invite 927B. We don't summon her. We just need to ensure the system no longer creates situations where someone like her has to defend herself that way." They agreed with their eyes, not because they feared Camille, but because they feared what Camille represented, a reminder that power cannot hide forever behind uniforms, that morality needs no siren to stop a patrol car when necessary. The recording was sent to 3 state-level oversight agencies. A summary was prepared for the Inspector General of Homeland Security, and a final copy, encrypted with a special code, was placed in the classified archive of the Office of Strategic Personnel Coordination for National Defense, a repository reserved only for files of individuals considered morally strategic assets, a term never officially recognized, but quietly maintained as a safeguard for those whose silent weight could alter the course of a system. At the same time, within the Internal Record Archive Center, which maintains disciplinary data on law enforcement nationwide, Delroy's file was abruptly moved into the urgent review category. A 3-person team from internal inspection received the transfer order without comment, but the supervising officer, a woman who had once served in Mosul, added a red label to the folder and wrote in ink, "Trust temporarily suspended." That phrase appeared in no regulation, but anyone who had served in Homeland Security knew what it meant. When no one believes you are a human being before they believe you are an officer, you no longer belong here. In the basement of the internal detention wing, Delroy was in isolation. No arrest warrant, no formal charge, but he was under 24/7 surveillance. Every movement he made triggered thermal scans and facial expression recording. At one point, he tried using the intercom to demand an explanation, only to receive a flat response. "We don't need a reason when you are no longer trusted as a law enforcement entity." At lunch, his meal was pushed through a slot in the door, cold, missing a spoon, and without a napkin. When he asked for one, the shift officer replied, "She didn't even have to speak to get you in here, so what exactly do you think you're still entitled to ask for?" During the lunch break in the technical surveillance department, a clip from the footage was replayed among the analysis teams. No one made public commentary, but every eye paused at the moment Camille stepped to her daughter's car, gently placed her hand on the girl's shoulder. No tears, no shouting, no threats, then took a single step back. A veteran agent, who usually scoffed at the word morality, was the first to remove his headphones, bite his lip, and say, "I've defused bombs in Kandahar, but I've never seen someone stand still and make an entire system tremble like that." The younger staff fell silent. One whispered, "Delroy should have known silence is only terrifying when it doesn't need a single shot." Upstairs, his name was scrubbed from all duty rosters in under 15 minutes. The meeting ended after 2 hours and 13 minutes. No applause, no lengthy closing remarks, no formal recommendations. But everyone understood. Next time, if any of them had to face someone who said nothing, stood still, and simply looked at them, they would question the system before questioning that person. And maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't dare ask anything at all. There was no special bulletin, no late banking headline, no emergency press conference. When the truth slipped out of the system, it didn't choose to walk through the front gate. It filtered through the smallest cracks. A local newspaper in a southern suburb, which typically only covered traffic congestion, corn price drops, and high school basketball, suddenly published an article under a quiet title, "The Woman on the Lexus." Was she a veteran? The article didn't mention a name. It drew no conclusions. It simply cited an anonymous source, stating that an incident involving a discretionary stop had been recorded, that the individual stopped had a military background, and that all data was transmitted within 10 minutes of the event. And most importantly, the article included a photo. It wasn't a frame from a body cam, nor from any official agency. It was a cropped, low-resolution image, but its composition was impossible to ignore. In the photo, a black woman stood next to her car, showing no sign of confusion, no sign of being detained, no visible reaction. She stood upright, both hands at her sides, eyes looking toward the photographer, or perhaps beyond the lens, beyond the scene itself, as if she were confronting someone the entire world would one day have to answer to. No one knew her name, but beneath the image, the caption, printed in small, italicized, non-volt font, read, "She didn't flinch, not once." Across social media platforms, the article was initially shared by only a few dozen people, but by the next morning, it had appeared in the comment sections of countless unrelated posts, from sports updates to weather reports, accompanied by a recurring question. Has anyone confirmed the identity of that woman yet? An anonymous account, verified as a retired Pentagon employee, reposted the article with just 3 words, "She once saved me." Immediately beneath it, someone sneered, "And now she'll save Officer Delroy from unemployment too," but that comment didn't last long. 48 seconds later, it was flagged over 500 times for hateful and unethical speech. The account was permanently banned. A day later, an internal social media manager at the Federal Police Department had to issue a directive. The term Lexus woman is not to be used in mocking or sarcastic contexts. Any violations will result in suspended access to the security system. At the police precinct where Delroy had served, his nameplate was removed overnight. No announcement, no memo, just a curt phone call from a superior. Don't let that name show up in the main hallway again. On the metal locker where he had once kept personal items, someone had stuck a yellow post-it note with a single line written in red ink. "She stood. You flinched." No one took it down all week. When he came to collect his things, a female officer on duty intentionally left her phone on speaker while playing a voicemail. A news segment discussing how a senior officer, formerly commanding rapid response units in the Middle East, was being tracked by the media for identification. He froze, but everyone around him remained silent, as if nothing had happened, except for the screech of a janitor dragging a chair past, who bumped his shoulder, then exhaled with a voice that was more spit than breath. "Now you know what it feels like to be stared at and left unspoken for." Not long after, at a small diner where a few retired officers gathered, a phone on the table suddenly played a clip from the article. The waitress, the daughter of a former soldier, froze at the final line, turned to a familiar customer near the exit and asked, "You think anyone stands like that without having given something up?" The question hung in the air until an older man set his coffee cup down and answered in a dry voice, "People only stand like that when they know no one else will stand in their place." Silence fell over the diner. In the shadowy corner, someone quietly reposted the photo with the caption, "This isn't about her name, this is about yours." And then, for the next 2 days, no one referred to Delroy by name. On internal message boards, his account was labeled extracted subject. In the federal personnel management system, his file was flagged as pending ethics review, class 5, a level rarely invoked, typically reserved for individuals responsible for systemic moral crises. A system originally built to protect those in uniform had now activated its own filtration protocol to eliminate someone whom the public didn't need to name to remember, because they remembered every movement he had made. Not because he mattered, but because he was the reason someone once silent had to stand, and that shook the system more than any previous data leak ever had. The photo spread faster than the article. On small forums for military enthusiasts, on veterans' community sites, it began circulating as a silent reminder. No hashtags, no slogans, just an image and a gaze. But in an era where everything was defined by frequency and outrage, the silence in that photo made people pause. Some believed it was a PR campaign for the Army. Others thought it was staged. But soon, every detail was dissected. The stitching on the blouse, the model of the car, the blurred license plate, and from that skepticism, anger began to emerge, not directed at the woman in the image, but at whatever force had made someone like her stand motionless in the street, just to prove she had done nothing wrong. Soon after, major newspapers picked up the story. CNN never mentioned her name. MSNBC aired a feature about strategic silence. The Washington Post dubbed it the Lexus encounter. But one article in Military Times, concise and cutting, struck straight into the public conscience. If someone who once saved dozens of soldiers has to stand still in the street, waiting for a cop to interrogate her like a criminal, then something is broken at the root. In that article, for the first time, a snippet of dialogue was leaked. Camille's voice, neither loud nor sharp, just 4 words, "You've gone far enough." And from then on, the phrase began appearing on baseball caps, on plain white t-shirts, no logo, no color, just the words, "Enough." An internal communications officer at the Department of Homeland Security, who had nothing to do with the incident, was removed from the duty roster after sharing the article with the comment, "I wonder how Delroy feels." That question, seemingly harmless, was quickly flagged by a senior media coordination group with a unanimous assessment. This is not the time to ask that. This is the time when people don't want to hear his name. And as a natural reflex of the entire system, all reports related to the incident were revised. Delroy's name was replaced by a temporary identifier code, accompanied by a note, "Original citation not needed. This individual does not represent the organization." At an ethics symposium on law enforcement in Baltimore, a female scholar who normally avoided political subjects suddenly stood up mid-discussion, raised a photo, and asked, "How many of you have considered that we may be starting to treat silence as a threat?" The room went dead silent. In a corner, a sheriff's representative, once a colleague of Delroy, tried to pull out his phone to avoid eye contact, but his hands shook so badly he dropped the device. A short clip captured that moment with the caption, "They all flinched," and it spread at lightning speed. By that afternoon, the man was officially pulled from the speaker list for the event. Meanwhile, Delroy, said to be on unpaid administrative leave, was seen at a small local grocery store. A customer recognized him, didn't shout, didn't point, simply told the cashier, "I'm not buying anything if he's still in the store." The cashier didn't ask why, just turned to him and said, "I think you should leave." He quietly walked out, but the store's internal security camera caught him standing at the door for 10 straight minutes, not moving, not calling, not reacting, as if he were trying to determine whether he was still a part of this place. Even the neighborhood paperboy was told by his parents, "If you go to that house, don't knock, just slip the paper through the slot, and don't say anything if someone opens the door." That line, seemingly simple, was recorded by the child himself while recounting the story to a friend, and by the next morning, the audio was edited into a short animated clip titled, "Distance is Earned," gaining more than 1 million views in under 48 hours. No one needed to mention Camille by name, but everyone knew which name no longer needed to be spoken. And in that quiet spreading, it wasn't really cries or calls for protest. It was a gaze from a photograph that made people reflect on themselves. And for the first time in years, a silence with no justification forced a society to respond. Delroy was not mentioned. No one spoke his name. There was no formal verdict, no public disciplinary action, but within law enforcement circles, the name Mark Delroy began to vanish from conference rosters, was replaced in training sessions, and withdrawn from internal oversight groups. No orders were issued, but everyone understood he had been seen through the eyes of a nation without needing airtime. Riley never brought up the incident again, but when he attended a training course for young officers 2 weeks later, a lecturer posed a scenario. If you meet someone who doesn't react, doesn't show emotion, doesn't resist, what do you think? One trainee stood up. I'd ask myself, am I looking at composure or the exhaustion of someone who's been tested their whole life? No one said another word. And Riley knew, somehow, Camille had been present in that classroom without entering. At State Police Headquarters, a brief note reading, "Review all reports signed by Delroy from 2018 onward," was pinned to the internal bulletin board. No signature, but it was printed using a Level 2 access code, only issuable from the Interdepartmental Oversight Office. A small team was formed solely to review old files, and although no specific violations were found yet, a legal advisor quietly stated during a closed meeting, "I'm not looking for faults. I'm looking for traces of attitude." That statement was later quoted on the department's internal social network as a Black Adam Nestor image with white text, and within 3 hours it had over 1,000 shares with the caption, "Not everyone is guilty, but everyone leaves a trace." In a behavioral psychology podcast hosted by a former special operative, the latest episode, titled "The One Who Didn't Bow," dedicated 40 minutes to analyzing the Camille effect, a newly coined term that emerged just 3 weeks after the incident, describing a societal state where one person's silence causes an entire power structure to tremble. While Delroy's name wasn't mentioned, a snippet of audio from a crisis management class was played, where an instructor asked, "How do you react when you realize your actions will be remembered solely because of someone else's silence?" That question was clipped into a short video, spreading to 2 million views in 36 hours, and on Reddit, a user posted, "Delroy may vanish from all documents, but he can't vanish from the reflexes of a new generation of officers." Around the same time, a painting began to take form in a small studio in New Orleans. The artist, once a battlefield medic, now a portrait painter, took inspiration from a cropped old photo. But he didn't paint streets or cars, only a pair of eyes. No colors, no shading, just 2 eyes staring straight ahead, encased in glass. Beneath the painting was a small wooden plaque, "The Colonel We Didn't Know We Needed." At a Colorado Springs Veterans Association gathering, a woman in an old khaki jacket wearing a support unit badge stood to speak mid-end. Her voice was choked but firm. "I don't know her, but I know what it feels like to be scrutinized for something you can't take off, and I know this. The one who forced her to stand still that day does not deserve to be called anyone's teammate." The entire hall applauded. In the corner, an officer in plain clothes quietly removed his name tag, placed it on the table, and left the room. At the Internal Affairs Division, Delroy's name disappeared from the system's permissions list in under 24 hours after the review directive was issued. But a leaked email showed the IT director had added a note, "Don't delete, just freeze," so no one forgets. That remark became the title of an editorial on a respected legal news site. We don't need another Mark Delroy, but we need to remember why there ever was one. The article didn't go viral among the general public, but within the law enforcement community it was memorized line for line. So much so that at a conference in Austin, a delegate quoted the final sentence in his closing remarks: "Silence doesn't protect anyone. But sometimes it's a sign that someone else has started listening." And in the very town where the incident took place, a small change was noticed, one no one could ignore. The corner cafe where Delroy once came every morning now had a sign, "Takeout only," but no one else was asked to take their drinks to go, only him. When asked why, the barista simply replied, "No one wants to share air with someone who made silence necessary." Later, the sign was replaced with a simpler message, "No space for excuse." It became the most viral check-in spot on social media for 3 consecutive days. No one said it outright, but everyone understood. Some names don't need to be convicted. They just don't get invited back. No one confirmed the identity in the painting. No one assigned a name. But the piece was displayed at an exhibit titled "Silence and Power" at the National Library 3 months later. The crowd wasn't large, but everyone who left did so quietly. No discussions, no photos, just a note in the guest book in slanted, delicate handwriting. "We used to think we knew what freedom was. Now we only know it doesn't live in the loudest voice." The painting was not protected by bulletproof glass, had no rope barriers, but was the only artwork in the exhibit that no one dared to stand too close to. At one moment, when a group of law students passed by, one of the younger attendees whispered, "Why doesn't this one have a caption?" And his classmate replied, "Because if you need a caption, you're not ready to understand it." That exchange was accidentally recorded by a nearby photojournalist. In just 13 seconds long, the clip went viral across platforms, tagged, no caption needed, and within 48 hours, more than 700,000 people had used the tag to reference the unspeakable. While the public debated the painting, a quiet internal action took place at the state-level police training headquarters. Officer Mark Delroy's name was erased from tactical procedure training materials. An old video clip of him lecturing, once used as a case study for rigid but by-the-book conduct, was replaced by a blank screen with a single warning line. "This content no longer meets current." No one explained why, but in the hallway, young cadets passing one another didn't need to speak. They simply nodded subtly, as if silently sharing a new understanding. The man who once preached protocol no longer deserved to be mentioned, not even in a slide. In the town where it all began, a group of high school art students quietly carried out a street visual project. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't make noise. They simply posted a white poster on a wall showing a police cap abandoned on cracked ground beside a pair of neatly placed female military boots. No text, but by the next morning the poster had been torn down, then replaced overnight by an identical copy. This continued for a full week, and on the 5th replacement, the local authorities ordered its removal, only to be met with fierce community resistance. The protest wasn't about the image itself. It was about something deeper. For the first time, they realized there was something that could not be scraped off a wall without leaving a mark. At a higher level, an internal report from the Department of Justice sent to federal agencies concerning standardized conduct in the context of social media response did not mention Camille's name, nor did it directly reference the incident. But in the appendix, a rare line enclosed in red read, "In cases where silence becomes the driving force of public discourse, The entire dialogue protocol and initial contact personnel must be reassessed. That note, intended for internal circulation only, was leaked and spread rapidly across political social networks. It required no interpretation. The public already understood. No one writes a sentence like that for a procedural mishap. That kind of warning appears only when a system has been shaken awake by something it once considered empty. A guest speaker at Howard University, a former federal prosecutor, was asked about the incident during a panel discussion. She replied with a single clipped sentence. When we needed someone to scream, she chose silence. And because of that, the whole system was forced to listen. No one laughed in the auditorium, but a student captured that moment and posted it with the caption, "Delroy screamed his whole life. She just looked." The post received over 1 million interactions, and the visual contrast between those two extremes, the shout and the gaze, became the emblem of a new wave. No confrontation needed, just the refusal to bow. Camille did not speak. She gave no interviews. She wrote no essays. She issued no public statements. But in a world overwhelmed by people who talk too much and think too little, she didn't need to appear to be remembered. Because once a society starts to ask, "Who is she?" what they're really asking is, what have we done to make someone like her remain silent until silence itself became a tactic? No one told Riley he had to choose a side. There was no internal memo requiring his signature. No officer sat across from him and said, "You must stand with Delroy or with no one at all." But Riley understood. It was precisely that silence that made for the most dangerous form of coercion, because it gave him the illusion that he was still neutral, that he was merely a witness, that he had done nothing wrong. Yet each morning, as he put on that uniform, Riley found himself staring at the mirror a little longer, not to straighten his tie, but to see whether the eyes looking back still resembled the man he was yesterday. And when he realized they grew dimmer with each passing day, he knew the time for standing in the middle had ended. The incident didn't fade. It didn't settle like the temporary unrest he had seen in the force before. It wasn't resolved by moving Delroy to another shift or by gathering the team for a stern debrief. The event seeped into the system like a fracture beneath concrete. At first unnoticed, but soon everyone could feel it. Something had broken without making a sound. Conversations in the break room grew shorter when Riley walked in. The nods became quieter, more reluctant, and once, while on patrol with a colleague, he noticed someone had scribbled a line inside the vehicle's glove compartment. "Be wary of those who don't know when to shut their eyes." Riley didn't erase the message, but he didn't say anything either. He didn't object. He didn't explain. He just looked at it, then quietly stepped outside and stood under the sun, wondering, was that what Camille once felt? Standing in the street with her military ID in hand, between two men, one who might pull the trigger at any moment, and the other hesitating between what was right and what was easy. Riley knew he hadn't spoken up. He hadn't stopped Delroy, even though he knew deep down what was happening was wrong. And it was that inaction, that failure to act, that he couldn't forgive himself for. At the vehicle maintenance bay, the technician who used to be Delroy's close friend began refusing to service any unit when Delroy's name appeared on the checklist. When asked by a supervisor, he gave a single reply: "Cars have emergency brakes. People don't." That sentence was later repeated during an all-staff meeting, and it eventually spread beyond, surfacing on a state officer's forum like an encrypted warning. No names needed. Everyone knew who it was about. And, like the quiet fracture, it continued to ripple through the layers of law enforcement culture, and no one dared stop it. Delroy's name began disappearing from the duty rosters. No official directive was issued, but each time he scanned his ID at the attendance system, it returned an unrecognized workstation error. HR blamed a technical glitch, but after the third time, he understood. And when he entered the staff cafeteria, He wasn't handed a meal voucher like the others. The storeroom attendant didn't refuse him. He simply turned to a nearby rookie and asked, "Do you think we should serve a man whose mere presence makes his team bow their heads in shame?" The rookie said nothing, but as Delroy turned to leave, Riley caught the young man's gaze. It held no anger, no contempt, only a silence that shut down any path to redemption, disappointment with no return. A private forum for spouses and relatives of law enforcement officers posted an anonymous entry titled, "The Shadow Beside the Patrol Car." The piece didn't name names or describe the incident in detail, but told the story of a wife discovering that her husband once watched a wrongful act and said nothing, simply because the offender wore the same uniform. In the comment section, another user, with a profile picture of a folded flag against a black background, left a single sentence. "My husband didn't die from the shooter. He died from the one who watched." That comment was screenshotted and turned into a meme, paired with a black and white image of a pair of military boots left at the roadside. No caption, no source, but everyone knew which story it came from. At the local mayor's office, where Delroy had once appeared at a ceremony honoring outstanding officers the year before, the group photo including him was quietly taken down. In its place was a blank frame, kept at the same size, replaced with no alternative image. When asked why, the receptionist simply replied, "We left it empty to remind ourselves not to fill space with something that once made us ashamed." The answer was captured during a short live stream by a group of independent journalists, and within 12 hours, the phrase "honor gap" became a trending hashtag, now used to describe positions once occupied by power but unworthy of ethical standing. And so, Delroy, though never officially disciplined, entered a phase no one wanted to walk alongside. Those who once called him brother now diverted course when spotting him from afar. The warm handshakes turned into tight-lipped nods, followed by feigned distraction. One day, as he passed by his former office, someone had left the door ajar and played a wordless piano solo, slow, with high notes like drops of metal echoing in an empty room. He said nothing, but as the melody played, a young officer walking past murmured a line into the air, not aimed at anyone, not needing a reply. Music's not played so someone can listen. It's played so someone remembers they once stayed silent when they shouldn't have. Riley stood by the window, watching Delroy walk away in silence, and he understood there are verdicts not written in files, but handed down daily in glances, in turned backs, in the kind of silence that forces a person to confront themselves. And this time, he didn't need to say anything, because Camille's very existence had become the answer that could not be erased. 1 week after the incident, he was summoned to the Internal Affairs office, not for interrogation, but to receive feedback. A middle-aged man, his demeanor polite to the point of slipperiness, asked, "If you could do it over, how would you have handled that situation?" Riley didn't answer right away. He looked down at the table, where blank report forms were stacked neatly, as if the moment he said the wrong thing, someone would fill in the empty spaces with ink that couldn't be erased. At last, he said, "I think I should have asked her if she was okay, instead of asking for her ID first." The man smiled. A short, emotionless smile. "Good answer. Neutral. Thank you for your cooperation." Riley left not with a sense of relief, but of having been pressed into a mold. On his way back, he passed the corridor where the internal bulletin board was mounted flush against the wall. In the bottom right corner of the board, once reserved for tributes to veteran officers, a sheet of standard letter-sized paper was taped up, bearing a bold message. Sometimes, choosing no side is choosing the wrong side. No logo, no signature. But underneath, someone had scribbled in red ink, "Only those who've been silent understand that best." Riley read it, then quietly walked on. No one told him how to feel, but each step felt like it pressed down on something still unresolved within. A shame no one accused him of, yet weighed as if it were a sentence he had authored in silence. He began to write, not to post, not to send, just fragments of thought, penned in ink, on the same kind of paper he once used for weekly reports. In it, he recounted every detail from that day, not omitting a single glance, a single motion, a single breath Camille took. But more importantly, for the first time, He admitted on paper, "I did not stand on the right side. Not because I chose the wrong one, but because I chose none at all." He folded those lines, placed them in an envelope unaddressed and unsent. He stored it in his personal locker, a draft of something he might one day be brave enough to reveal. Meanwhile, in Delroy's former office, someone quietly removed his nameplate from the desk and replaced it with a blank slab of wood. Nothing carved, just emptiness. When a young officer asked why it hadn't been replaced with the new person's name, the supervisor replied, "No one wants to sit in a place where the darkness hasn't been cleared." The next day, the room was reassigned as a records archive, but the old chair stayed where it was, and in meetings, whenever someone brought up lessons to be learned, all eyes would unconsciously drift toward that door, as if it still held something inside no one dared open. A brief announcement appeared on the internal social network for law enforcement personnel, stating, "We recommend refraining from using any footage related to the traffic stop on the 17th during training to avoid psychological task confusion." But in the comments section, an anonymous user posted the photo of Camille standing beside the car with no caption. Within 20 minutes, the image was paired with an audio clip of her voice. "You've gone far enough." Stitched together like an unofficial PSA, the video quickly went viral on the internal sharing platform, becoming the most viewed, unauthorized training material for 3 consecutive weeks. Beneath every reposted version was a recurring comment, "We didn't learn from her, we learned from her silence." At a retirement ceremony for an officer at the station, Riley stood quietly in the last row, hands in pockets, saying nothing, as names were read aloud. Those who had helped build the department's reputation, Delroy's wasn't mentioned. But when the speaker said, "There are names to remember and names to leave behind," no one needed further explanation. In a moment of stillness, Riley caught the eye of an old colleague, one who had been silent when Delroy spoke that day, and in a slight nod from across the room, the two seemed to acknowledge something unspoken that would never be forgotten. An Avderny governmental organization published its annual report on public trust in law enforcement, and for the first time included a new metric, Ethical Silence Index. In the footnote it stated, "We do not measure what officers say, we measure what they choose not to say when it mattered most." That phrase, ethical silence, was quoted in a New Yorker article as evidence that society had begun to distinguish between silence born of self-preservation and silence born of having no other option. And, in Riley's own office, those same words were scrawled in pencil on the back of his nameplate, not for anyone else to read, but to remind himself each day. He told no one about the letter sitting in his locker. No one needed to know, because, in truth, the only thing he had left from that day wasn't his title or his reputation, but a question with no answer. If he had stood on the right side that day, would she still have needed to stand alone? And that very question, though never spoken aloud, had become the only sentence he was willing to live with. Then, one night, while on solo patrol through the eastern residential district, so quiet that his own footsteps echoed like alarms, he happened upon a middle-aged woman walking her dog, wearing a hoodie with the words "Enough distance." She didn't look at him. There was nothing to suggest she knew anything about the incident, but the presence of that phrase in the dark felt like someone had called his name, not to accuse him, but to remind him that people always know who stays silent. The next morning, as he passed a charity food station in the area, he saw a group of teenage volunteers distributing ration tickets, all wearing round white badges. No symbols, just 4 simple words. She didn't flinch. Not once. He didn't stop, but when one of the kids by the door caught his eye and nodded, Riley realized the gesture wasn't a greeting. It was a question. Which side did you stand on? On the internal bulletin board of the precinct, someone had posted a slanted note. "Some silences endure," written in the ink of trust that was lost. No signature. But people began whispering that it didn't need one, because that message wasn't meant to be challenged. It was meant to make the silent look inward. When Riley stepped into the break room during his shift, A familiar colleague was watching a re-edited news montage, one that intercut Camille standing still beside the car with government slogans about justice and civic duty. A low, pulsing soundtrack accompanied the voiceover. Sometimes, the weak don't need to speak, they just need not to fall. The video had garnered over 3 million views in 1 week and was being shared as an unspoken declaration. Riley said nothing, but the colleague next to him glanced, then looked away, as if avoiding eye contact with someone whose silence had once carried consequences. A few days later, Riley received a letter from someone who left no name. Inside was a small card, bearing a single sentence written in careful script. No response is still a response, but don't let it be your last one. He didn't need to check who sent it, didn't need to trace the return address. He simply folded the card and placed it inside the same old envelope, then added one final line beneath everything he had ever written: "Next time, I will speak. And if no one listens, I will say it again. Not so someone changes, but so I won't be the same as I was that day." The Monday morning briefing went on as usual, except for one change. The supervisor no longer used the phrase standardizing response protocols when referring to inspection cases. Instead, he emphasized, "There are things the law permits, but morality doesn't. I don't need you to follow the right procedure, I need you to be the right person." At the far end of the table, Riley locked eyes with a young officer who was jotting down every word. He knew it was those newcomers who would no longer accept silence as a form of self-defense, and it was also they who would reflect, like a mirror, the lack of courage in those who came before. And that was the moment Riley chose a side. Not with a statement, not with a resignation letter, not with a slap across the system's face, but with a very small change. The next day, when a young black man was stopped for matching a vague description, Riley was the first to approach and ask, "Are you okay?" And when his colleague raised an eyebrow, he didn't look back. He simply said, "I didn't ask last time. This time I am." Riley did not attend the meeting. He was not invited, nor did he want to be there. But he knew it happened, knew the exact time, the precise location, the names of those who would sit at the table, and even the kind of coffee that would be poured into cups bearing the police department's logo. And he also knew, though the paperwork labeled it an internal discussion on the handling of checkpoint number 6, in reality it was a dialogue with intent to protect an individual not because he was right, but because he was not allowed to be publicly wrong. Delroy walked into the meeting room wearing a blank expression, his gait unchanged from the days before the incident, but Riley guessed, if one looked closely, the dark rings under his eyes would be noticeable, not clear whether from sleeplessness or the growing realization of isolation seen in the increasingly hollow morning handshakes at shift change. There were only 5 people in that meeting room: 1 representative from Internal Affairs, 1 deputy head of communications, 2 lawyers from the Administrative Counsel Office, and Delroy. No civilians, no media, no recordings. The first to speak was the lawyer on the left, a woman in her early 40s wearing a neutral-toned blouse, hair tied neatly back, her voice devoid of even a trace of emotional inflection. "Officer Delroy, we are not here today to charge you. We're here to ensure that you and this organization are not harmed by the public's distorted interpretation." That opening line, compared to the concept of justice Riley had once studied in the academy, was nothing short of a blatant renunciation. But in that room, it served as the foundation upon which the rest would be built. How to redefine truth without having to change its essence. Delroy sat still. He did not interrupt, did not offer excuses. He knew the rules, knew that he didn't need to win by reason, he just needed to survive the meeting. The second voice came from the deputy head of communications, a man who had coordinated over 10 public relations crises before, his tone flat and cold like a pre-written draft. "We need to standardize the messaging in case of inquiry. No confirmations, no denials. The only phrase you are to use is 'I am following all trained procedures and cooperating fully.' Nothing more, nothing less." Across the table, another individual flipped through a file, stopping precisely on the page containing Delroy's past psychological review. where an internal assessment once concluded, rapid reactive agent, prone to coercive behavior under pressure, periodic behavioral monitoring recommended. They made no remarks, only exchanged glances. And then one of the legal advisors floated a suggestion, so cold no one dared to repeat it in the minutes. If questions intensify, we can strategically leak a partial image, blurred and without sound, to strip viewers of full context and limit judgment. No one mentioned Camille's name. No one spoke of her gaze, the ID badge, or the final words that had choked the entire system with a truth no one wished to confront. They handled the issue like a technical glitch, noisy input data, overreaction from the media, in need of narrative adjustment and public redirection. But in the meeting room, the ceiling lights flickered once, and no one could say whether it was weak power or another form of instability manifesting. Amid all this, a mid-level member, the only one in the room who had once served alongside Camille during a domestic support operation 3 years prior, quietly pushed back his chair. No one noticed. But he said nothing, simply closed his notebook and left the room before the meeting ended. No request, no notice. The next day, his name disappeared from the internal coordination list, with no explanation. Throughout the meeting, Delroy spoke only once. Not to apologize, not to defend himself, but to ask, "So, do we need to release any statement?" The question was not directed at anyone in particular, but it landed like a tap against a cracking pane of glass. And the answer came quickly, as if prepared in advance, "No. If you don't issue a statement, the matter will not become a formal accusation. Everything stays here." Before leaving the room, the head of legal turned to Delroy, no longer with empathy, but with a warning cloaked in calm. "But if you say anything else, even over a private dinner, the system will have to decide who's more worth protecting." No one emphasized the word who, but Delroy understood. He was no longer among the names prioritized for preservation. Riley heard about the meeting from a colleague, not officially, not through email, just a loose comment in the break room. "Delroy's covered. He'll be fine. We protect our own." That statement echoed like a coded directive, a way of saying, anyone who dares bring it up, anyone who sides with her, is swimming against the current. And that current, Riley understood, did not flow for justice, but to preserve the structure, to protect the image, to protect collective authority. Delroy returned to duty 3 days after the meeting. No one welcomed him, but no one ostracized him either. That silence was the most effective shield the system had ever created. It needed no words, only the illusion that the wrongdoer was not alone, and that the righteous would feel isolated if they spoke up. But there was one small change that Riley noticed. In Delroy's locker, usually tidy and sterile, there was now a folded photo with a torn edge. Riley passed by, he saw it depicted a man, likely Delroy's father, in an old military uniform, shaking hands with what appeared to be a high-ranking black officer. The other man's face was cut off, but that single detail was enough for Riley to realize Delroy was not as numb as he pretended. He had also grown up on stories of honor and service, and that's what made his silence today all the more tragic. No one punished Delroy. No disciplinary report, no pay cut, no transfer, but everyone knew he had been judged not by the system, but by the eyes of those who had begun to look into it with suspicion. And the system, through a backwards kind of logic, chose to keep him not because he deserved to stay, but because if they let him go, they would be admitting they let him exist in the first place. The meetings concluded. The heavy wooden doors had been shut. The reports were signed with ink that left no smudges. Delroy returned to his shift, and it seemed as though everything had passed, like a faint crease pressed flat among 1,000 administrative pages. But what the system didn't anticipate, or had grown too used to fearing, were those living in its shadows. Not radicals, not outsiders, but the very cogs of the machine which had long assumed themselves invisible. One of them this time chose not to endure in silence. The individual who leaked the file left no name, no trace. just a single PDF file sent to the anonymous inbox of an investigative journalist from an independent outlet in Seattle. A man who had quietly followed Camille Hightower's case from the beginning, not out of trend, but because he believed that the things left unspoken were often the ones most worth saying. The email contained no explanation, no preamble, just a single line: "If the system won't be transparent, let the public be the judge." The file was 83 pages long. Each page documented a moment when Delroy had been recorded violating procedural conduct. Not major infractions, but frequent enough to become a pattern. One instance detailed his unlawful search of a homeless individual, citing suspicious behavior without presenting evidence. Another recounted his order to stop a woman driving with a child merely because she looked nervous upon noticing the patrol car behind her. Yet another internal report, previously marked internal resolution, no escalation needed, noted Delroy intimidating a black student by forcing him to stand facing a wall for more than 20 minutes, claiming to assess reactive nerves. But most notable, and most damning to the system, was a record from 7 years earlier, crossed out in red ink and stamped "insufficient grounds to proceed with investigation." It revealed that Camille Hightower had once recommended Delroy's removal during a special review on conduct standards for patrol officers in military-civilian border zones. At the time, serving in an interagency coordination role, she had participated in a covert observation and submitted the following in an internal report. "This officer tends to respond with authority rather than reasoning, and when encountering individuals who do not fit the model he imposes, he easily conflates silence with threat." That recommendation was dismissed. The rationale entered into the file: insufficient verification. Officer does not present a high-risk behavior profile. And like all decisions made for convenience rather than truth, Delroy remained in position. Camille never mentioned his name again, not once. But now, with everything exposed, people understood this was not the first time the two had faced each other. This was a cycle the system had ignored until it came back to bite its hand. The journalist didn't publish immediately. He spent 3 nights cross-verifying, not out of doubt, but because he knew a strike against the system had to be placed precisely, deep enough, accurate enough, and quiet enough. He traced personnel records, matched signatures, and checked archival timestamps. When everything aligned, he wrote. No clickbait headline, no photo of Camille, no placement in the Hot Topics banner. The article was published under Dossiers Society. Interpretive analysis titled 83 pages, let one stay until another had to go. Silent in the street. The article spread slowly, but as it spread, it didn't trigger the usual social media fury. Instead, it provoked calibrated inquiries from public defender groups, civil oversight organizations, and several veteran associations. The question was no longer, "Who is Camille?" It became, "Why did she warn us? And why didn't the system listen?" A few days later, Military Conduct Review published an in-depth piece citing the old file, describing Delroy as a prime example of unorthodox predictive accuracy from those we failed to listen to in time. No one in the article condemned the system outright, but every line was a reminder that the greatest sin is not being wrong, it's letting the wrong repeat until it can no longer be corrected. Delroy remained silent. He kept working, still wore his badge, but ever since the article began circulating within professional circles, every time he walked into a meeting room, someone would stop talking. Someone would leave. Someone would place a thick file on the table in front of them, a quiet reply that said, "We know." And Delroy, though not fired, not prosecuted, not chased by the media, was paying, hour by hour, step by step, through every silent moment, in a room where no one believed he had merely been following protocol. When silence could no longer preserve order, words began to be used as weapons to rebuild what had already cracked. After Delroy's file was leaked, a wave of responses from the public, independent press, and watchdog organizations relentlessly assaulted the image the system had desperately tried to maintain, that of a stable law enforcement institution. The police department's Crisis Communications Center chose to shift strategies. If they couldn't extinguish the fire, they would redirect the public's gaze. And to do that, they did not target Delroy, whose disgrace had become too obvious. But the one element that gave the incident weight, Camille. No one spoke ill of her during press briefings. There were no official accusations. No government agency published anything overtly criticizing her, but through carefully selected interviews, subtly guided commentaries, and a barrage of expert opinions from people who had once worked near her, a silent campaign was set in motion to transform Camille from a symbol of calm into a question mark of motive. On a late-night political talk show, the host asked, could it be that this wasn't just a procedural failure, but a calculated move by someone trying to reignite debates about the force's power? A guest nodded thoughtfully. No one denies her past service. But her timely appearance, her silent approach, and the sophistication of the recordings suggest this may not have been the first time she tried to apply pressure from within. They didn't call Camille a saboteur, but they planted a seed of doubt that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't merely a victim. Articles began to multiply across mainstream media portals. Veteran hero or authority overreach. A system on trial, but who judges the judge? Silence as protest or silent manipulation? These headlines didn't just blur the truth. They evoked an unspoken discomfort. Camille wasn't being rejected. She was being reclassified as a problem to be reassessed. At the system management level, clandestine meetings were held between judicial, military justice, and media representatives to contain symbolic resonance. A new internal memo coined a term, post-impact narrative management, a tactic to reposition someone who had risen from anonymity to national prominence through a single event, back into a place the system found tolerable. No need to attack, just extract public trust from her. Camille said nothing, accepted no interview requests, made no TV appearances, issued no rebuttals. But that very refusal fed the campaign of suspicion. A major newspaper quoted a former officer. I respect her, but someone who once held such a position, now refusing to clarify, refusing to speak. Could it be she wants this story to spread unchecked? The argument was sleek, unaccusatory, yet it framed Camille's silence as strategic manipulation. Riley noticed what was happening. He said nothing, but kept notes in his small journal, each headline, each guided quote. One day he knocked on the door of a former colleague from the communications division, someone he knew had attended internal post-conflict image control training. When Riley asked bluntly, "Do you see this campaign as targeting Camille?" the man replied crisply, "They're not targeting a person. They're targeting the consensus she's creating." That answer said it all. An individual may be dismissed, but a truth that unsettles an entire structure must never be allowed to spread. In the following weeks, internal social analytics reported a sharp decline in public trust toward law enforcement. But what truly alarmed the strategic response teams wasn't the drop itself, it was who had contributed to it. Not the usual protesters, not opposition groups, but veterans once stationed on the front lines, women serving in public institutions, people of color who had long chosen silent compliance, and most significantly the politically silent, those who rarely spoke publicly but never reversed once they took a side. That erosion of trust didn't stem from anything Camille said. She didn't write, didn't issue statements, didn't post a single message on social media, but her presence altered the gravity around her. And what pushed the public to switch sides wasn't Camille's voice. It was the way the system responded to her silence. Silence is now seen as more dangerous than accusation. At a closed conference of state-level communications directors, a presentation was shown comparing recent media reactions. One slide froze the entire room. A still of Camille from the original video, no sound, only her eyes, with the headline from a major publication, "She didn't scream, so they screamed back louder." Beneath the slide, a red line plummeted on the chart, representing trust levels among female veterans, once assumed to be unwaveringly loyal to discipline and order. The presenter said one sentence, "We are not being punished for being wrong. We are being questioned for how we reacted to what was right. In a hasty move, 3 internal communications review boards were formed to reassess character image frameworks. But in the reports they sent, an anomaly emerged. The most organically shared content wasn't the sympathetic articles. It was the silent video clips of Camille. No voiceovers, no declarations, no slogans, just the image of her standing still in the street. And that alone terrified the system, because it was unspinnable, unblurred, and beyond blame. On an independent video platform, a young creator compiled all news clips on the incident, intercutting them with Camille's expressions from various angles. At the end, a silent line appeared. "She didn't ask to lead. We just followed the only person who didn't want to be followed." The video reached more than 12 million views in 1 week, and not a single media outlet dared request its removal, because they knew the harder they tried to erase it, the more people would share it. By month's end, a non-governmental watchdog released an evaluation on how media frames victims. In its 19-page appendix, Camille had her subsection titled, "The Price of Not Screaming When Silence is More Dangerous Than Rage." No commentary, no judgment, just a timeline highlighting each manipulated headline, each distorted quote, and side-by-side comparisons with other women, those who, when treated unjustly, didn't scream either yet were recast as cases whose motives needed scrutiny. At the end of the report, not typed but handwritten in black ink, tilted slightly to the right, a chilling final line stood like an exclamation mark amid the legal prose. A system that doesn't fight wrongdoing, but fights whoever reveals it, isn't operating, it's afraid. There was no press conference held in Camille's name. No open letter, no petition, no reform video released by her. Camille remained in the same place, not stepping forward, not retreating, carrying no flag and drawing no sword. But everything around her could no longer hold its ground. Lawmakers, those who once dismissed similar cases for lacking weight, and the ones who preferred statistical abstraction to confronting isolated phenomena, this time they had no way out. Because the name Camille Hightower, though never mentioned in any official document, had surfaced far too often. In internal briefings, in social metric dashboards, and most notably, in the eyes of voters who had gone silent in a very different way. A young congressman from Maryland, a former attorney who had once worked on a judicial oversight committee, was the first to speak aloud what many of his colleagues only dared think. If Camille Hightower's case isn't enough to change the law, then what is? The question required no rebuttal, but it echoed down congressional hallways, slipped into every closed-door meeting, lingered at bipartisan dinners, and reverberated in the minds of those who once believed silence was the best way not to lose more than they already had. No one answered him immediately, but just days later, in a closed-door session of senior legislators, a leaked recording surfaced, an audio clip of a veteran congresswoman stating bluntly, "If we let this bill die like all the others, we're effectively stamping approval for a system that chooses who gets to exist legally." That statement, though never officially confirmed, became the background image for an online campaign called "Existence is Not Permission," racking up millions of shares within 48 hours. Public pressure spiked less than a week later when a veteran, once indirectly under Camille's command, posted a short video under 1 minute long, saying, "We were trained to recognize the ones worth listening to, even when they don't give orders." Camille is one of those people. If she still has to stand alone on the roadside and none of you will rewrite the law, then you don't deserve to represent anyone who's ever worn this uniform. The video was reshared by major veterans organizations, and for the first time ever, a civil bill yet to pass was openly endorsed by veteran petitioners. An unprecedented move. Eventually, the proposal was formalized under the name the Hightower Clause, H.R. 1476. The draft itself wasn't long, but every sentence was crafted with near military precision, not only due to the gravity of the subject, but because the drafters understood If even one loophole remained, technical or ethical, the system would exploit it to pull everything back. The first clause mandated that all administrative stops without a court order involving citizens not actively committing a crime must be recorded via independently encrypted devices. The second required any officer with 3 or more internal complaints within 5 years to undergo external psychological evaluation. The third enforced that all misconduct data, including minor administrative sanctions, be uploaded to a federal oversight system and remain there, regardless of internal term transitions. And the final clause, the coldest, granted every citizen who had served in the military, intelligence, or special forces the right to directly confront law enforcement during an unlawful stop, without needing a lawyer, without intermediaries. All it took was identification and the calm presence needed to make the entire apparatus freeze. The public uproar wasn't about the content of the bill. It was about the name attached to it. People called it the Hightower Clause, though Camille never signed it, never endorsed it, and never gave a single interview related to it. That very name, unconfirmed, unembellished, became the spark for a social reckoning no press release could extinguish. A clause named for someone who never demanded rights for herself, yet forced the entire system to redefine the rights of others. Immediately, waves of opposition campaigns emerged. One law enforcement advocacy group issued a 14-page statement claiming the final clause was reverse discrimination, granting disproportionate power to minorities with military experience. However, within 3 days, a former internal affairs officer published an open letter on a public platform, stating, "If we're afraid of people with service backgrounds confronting us without lawyers, maybe we shouldn't be doing things that require confrontation in the first place." The letter became a flashpoint, receiving support from over 4,000 law enforcement professionals, including 300 active duty officers. Initially, the bill stalled. Some lawmakers cited technicalities, saying it lacked practical enforcement structures, a coded way of admitting they weren't ready to face the implications of officially recognizing that the system had failed one of its own. But the delay didn't last. When the second independent media report dropped, titled "Justice Once Looked Away" and used Camille Hightower as its mirror, public sentiment surged again. It wasn't anger anymore. It was awakening. People stopped asking whether Camille was right or wrong. They started asking, why does the system only listen after someone has suffered enough to stop speaking? Ultimately, the Hightower Clause went to a preliminary vote in the Oversight Subcommittee. On voting day, no one said her name. But during the hearing, an aging lawmaker who had opposed similar bills for years made a statement that left the room silent. "I used to think laws shouldn't be written from emotion. But then I replayed that recording. She didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't say a single word until the very end. And that's exactly why. This time, I think the law should speak for her." The bill passed 7-2, then 18-5 in the full subcommittee. And when it reached the House floor, a place where similar clauses had quietly died in filing cabinets, it went to public vote. Not out of pressure, but because no one had any valid reason to delay it anymore. Delegates from both sides agreed this wasn't a law for one person. It was a shield for those who might never get a second chance. Camille never commented on it. When a reporter asked her thoughts, indirectly, through a relative, only one sentence was returned: "I don't need a law with my name on it. But if it means someone won't have to stay silent the way I did, then what happened that day wasn't for nothing." And when the final line of the Hightower Clause was signed by the president, not in a grand press event, but during an emergency joint session between the 3 branches of government, people finally understood the deepest changes don't come from the loudest voices. They come from those forced into silence, who stood their ground until the voice came back. No one told Delroy he had to fall apart. No one in the old briefing room asked him how he was sleeping, about the mornings when he couldn't pull the dread out from under the department-issued blanket, or about the looks from coworkers who no longer smiled when he entered the room. He still wore the uniform, still pinned on the badge, still signed off on patrol logs, still responded to reports as if nothing had happened. But the system, the very thing he once believed to be immutable, now treated him like a body reacts to a foreign object that has been discovered but not yet expelled. No attack, no embrace, just surrounded by a cold silence, making him feel neither expelled nor accepted. He started withdrawing from conversations, from banter, from shared lunches, from the routine shooting drills, where each pull of the trigger had once been his assertion of control, now reduced to a hollow action with no justifiable target. In his head, the same question replayed every night. Why didn't she say anything? Not as a curiosity, but as a slow, bleeding echo that made sleep impossible. He had once believed himself accustomed to criticism, once thought coldness was armor, that conscience was something left outside the precinct door. But Camille, with her silence, her unguarded gaze, and a demeanor that required no validation, had done what no accusation had ever achieved. She made him doubt himself. Delroy began searching for information, not publicly, not through official channels. Just those quiet searches typed into a browser in the middle of the night as he sat alone at the third shift guard post, where the flickering hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound proving he was still awake. He reread every article, rewatched every frame, listened to every leaked audio, not to dispute it, but to try and understand what had made him act the way he did that day. And what horrified him most wasn't how people viewed him after the incident, but how he saw himself in the video. His voice, his posture, his body language, all of it carried the imprint of someone trying to make another person afraid, simply to cover up a fear he had never learned to name. There was one moment in the video that Delroy watched more than 30 times. The instant he commanded Camille to place her hands outside the car window, his voice sharp, his eyes avoiding the body camera. And as soon as she complied, no resistance, no rebuttal, just a silent nod, he stepped back, not for tactical reasons, but because her gaze looked straight through him, unflinching, unpleading, as if he no longer controlled anything in that situation, not even himself. Camille had made no threats, raised no voice, exercised no authority beyond her eyes, and those eyes saying, not I'm right, but forcing the question, are you doing this to uphold the law or to assert your power, struck the weakest part of Delroy, the one he had never faced, the fear of having to apologize when you no longer have the authority to command. He had once prided himself on being able to control any situation, but on that day when an independent human rights group analyzed the audio and found that his command rate doubled every time Camille remained silent, Delroy understood. He was the one who lost control first, and what scared him more was knowing, even as it was happening, that it was true, but continuing anyway. When a podcast unexpectedly revisited the incident, featuring a body language expert pointing out that Delroy tugged at his gun belt 4 consecutive times, even though Camille never moved, he couldn't sleep. Not because he was analyzed, but because he, who had also been trained to read such signals, had failed to see that he was acting out a series of instinctive, unethical, and indefensible behaviors. It took him nearly 3 weeks to make a decision that, a year ago, he would have scornfully dismissed, to request a meeting with Camille. Not through a lawyer, not through intermediaries. Not to argue, just to see her, once, from a different distance. Not the gap between badge and citizen, between enforcer and the enforced, but between someone who thought he was a tool of justice and someone who made the system. Look in the mirror. Delroy sent the request through a private channel. No one knew but him and an old friend, a former legislative aide now working at a veterans support organization. The friend didn't ask why, only said, I'll pass it along, but don't expect her to reply out of moral obligation. She's not here to redeem anyone. Delroy only nodded. He wasn't seeking redemption, just understanding. He wrote simply, if she agrees, I'd like to say one thing. Nothing more, no justification, no exit strategy, just the hope of hearing silence again. this time not as punishment, but as a reminder not to repeat the past. There was no response at first. A week passed, then 2. No reply, no rejection, no confirmation. But for Delroy, even that was enough to keep the last fragile strand of belief from shattering completely. In a world where every sound is broadcast to become a statement, that lack of reply was the rawest thing a former authority figure could face. A judgment unspoken, yet irreversible. He wasn't hoping for forgiveness. He wasn't hoping to hear he was wrong or right. He just wanted to understand why someone who said nothing could make the whole world speak. On a Saturday afternoon, while washing his car behind the precinct after shift, his phone buzzed softly. A short message. Tuesday, 10 a.m., the old cafe south of the city. Bring nothing. No signature, no confirmation, but he knew it was her. No GPS, no escort, no camera, just a place, a time, and a chance to arrive for the first time in his life, carrying nothing but silence, just as Camille once had. Delroy pressed and folded his uniform the night before, ironed each seam by hand, but did not wear it that day. He chose a plain shirt, no badge, no labels. When he entered the cafe, he didn't see Camille immediately. She sat in the far corner, not facing the door, not shielded, not scanning the room as if wary of eyes. He walked toward her, not timid, but without the posture of someone used to giving orders. Resting his hand on the chair opposite hers, he spoke, without waiting to be invited. I didn't come to apologize. I came to understand. And Camille, with that same gaze, quiet, sharp, expecting nothing from the person in front of her, said only one sentence, enough to encapsulate everything the system had failed to grasp. The problem was never what you understood about me. It's that you refused to understand anything about yourself until no one needed to say it anymore. Delroy sat for a long time after Camille left. She didn't prolong the meeting, didn't end it with a handshake or a courteous farewell. She simply stood up when her coffee cup was half empty, leaving behind a silence on the table, one not everyone has the stillness to notice. When she walked away, he didn't follow, didn't call out, didn't ask another question, and then the space around him grew strangely vast, not because she had left, but because everything familiar now felt excessive in the presence of someone who departed without offering a single justification. But there was one thing he didn't expect, that the barista that day, a young man who avoided eye contact with customers, would approach him, place a folded piece of paper on the table, and say softly, "If you want to understand, maybe it's time you knew who held the truth until it was ready." The paper contained nothing but a printed link. A string of characters that suggested nothing familiar, no recognizable social platform, but when Delroy typed the URL into a private browser at a quiet corner in a public library, where no one recognized him, where no one looked at him as a cop, what loaded was a familiar video, a shaky street-side angle, but unmistakable, the scene of him standing in front of Camille's car. His voice barking commands, sarcasm in his tone, his breathing quick and erratic, and Camille, unmoved, undisturbed, standing tall, her eyes not staring into the lens, but through it. His hands trembled, not because he recognized himself, but because he now knew a third person had seen it all, had witnessed the full truth, but didn't intervene, didn't disrupt, simply preserved the footage, not to harm him, but to wait for the right moment to confront it. But it wasn't just the video. At the bottom of the page, there was a note. "I'm the one who filmed this. I held on to it for 67 days, not out of fear, but because I had to be sure, when it came out, it wouldn't be used to destroy someone, but to awaken what's human in us." Delroy paused long at the word awaken, not because he didn't understand, but because he had once believed he didn't need to wake up. He had lived for years as a cog in the machine, a place where right and wrong were determined by forms and commands, where the silence of others was assumed to mean consent, and where he believed following procedure alone was enough to call himself just. The video didn't go viral. No millions of views, no flashy edits over trending music, but Among those who had the link, inside the system, officers who once leaned toward protecting our own, whispers began. Someone was filming. Someone who didn't interfere, but who saw. And that, more than any disciplinary hearing, was what made Delroy feel breathless. Because if someone saw and still stayed silent, then that silence wasn't abandonment, but a higher form of choice. A choice to let the wrongdoer confront himself rather than be dragged into light. The person behind the camera wasn't a journalist, an activist, or an acquaintance of Camille. He was just someone passing by at that very moment, who stopped, sensing that what he was witnessing wasn't a routine stop. He didn't speak, didn't step in, just pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and held it steady, as if he had nothing left to protect but the act of witnessing itself. His name was Andre Lewis, a freelance delivery worker, living 2 blocks from where the incident took place. He'd been stopped 3 times in 1 year, asked to open his trunk to make deliveries at unusual hours, ignored when he asked, "What's the reason for the stop, officer?" But Andre hadn't recorded those times, not once, until he saw Camille, not shouting, not grabbing her phone, not crying for help, just standing still, as though injustice had become so familiar that she no longer resisted it, she merely let it reveal itself. Andre recorded the moment, went home, watched the footage once, then closed it. He didn't share it, didn't send it to the press, didn't upload it to social media. Instead, he opened a private account, uploaded the clip to an encrypted server, and set the password as his daughter's name. The same daughter he always told, "If something happens, don't run, don't argue, stand still, so others see you're doing nothing wrong." But when Andre watched Camille standing silent in the street, he cried, because he realized, if justice needs to see before it acts, then maybe we must be the ones who see first. And he waited until articles began to circulate, until Camille's name appeared in untagged posts, until veteran organizations spoke up, until enough distance was no longer a slogan on a cap, but the emblem of a quiet reckoning, until the system began to tremble, not because it was attacked, but because it had been seen too clearly. Only then did Andre release the clip, not through a media blast, but through an encrypted link to an independent journalist, the one who had first written about Camille, who hadn't asked who's right or wrong, but only, "Why does this keep happening?" In his accompanying note, "I don't want to be a hero. I just want those covering their ears to stop pretending they don't see. I didn't save her. I just held on to the moment when the system should have saved itself. And when the footage was verified, unaltered, uncut, it didn't serve to condemn anyone, but to raise a question for an entire structure too used to operating in the dark." Camille knew about the video, but she didn't ask for it to be taken down, didn't object. She simply sent a message to a mutual friend of Andre's, just 1 sentence. "You don't have to say anything, but thank you for choosing to stay, not to save me, but to see that I never fell." The man behind the camera said nothing, but the image he captured, once made public, forced the entire system to take a step back, not in protest, but in the choking silence of a crowd that once believed it was in control of the narrative. But the story didn't end there, and what no one expected was that Camille, the woman who had refused all interviews, all forms of representation, who refused to turn pain into a weapon, would choose a moment no one foresaw: the joint congressional hearing on the Police Conduct Oversight Act and the Citizen Self-Protection Bill, where the nation was waiting to hear testimony from those who had truly shaped change. She did not sit in the center of the chamber. She did not arrive with a team of lawyers or aides. She entered the main hall like an ordinary citizen. White blouse, dark slacks, no name tag, no insignia, but no one in the chamber mistook her for anyone else. Camille Hightower, the name once avoided, once reduced to a file number, once buried under layers of objective analysis, now appeared in a space where speaking was no longer an option, but a duty, and she chose to speak. When the committee chair invited her to address the chamber, no one moved. Not because they expected a dramatic statement, but because they weren't sure she would speak at all. All they knew of her was silence, a silence that had caused millions to wonder how many moments they'd missed when they should have stood up. But When Camille placed her hand on the microphone, raised her head, and looked directly at those before her, she did not speak in the voice of someone wounded, but in the voice of someone who had survived the wounds of an entire system. "In all this time," she began, her voice low, slow, each syllable deliberate, "many have asked me why I didn't share the video, why I didn't speak up from the beginning. The answer is I did share. I shared by standing still, by not drawing a weapon, not flashing an ID, not calling the press, not raising anything except the unrequested existence of a black citizen in the heart of America. No one coughed, no one shifted in their seats. Those leaning on their desks loosened their grip, as if the weight of each word pressed down on their knuckles." Camille continued, "I am not a victim, but I am not a symbol either. I am simply the outcome of a system that has grown used to checking other people's presence without ever checking itself. And when I said nothing, I forced you to ask yourselves, do we only acknowledge a truth when it's shouted, recorded, and shared online?" A senator leaned forward, trying to catch every word, but Camille did not raise her voice. She did not recount the details of the incident, did not name Delroy, and did not offer evidence. Instead, she looked toward the rows of legislative aides and said, "I've lived in the military, where silence can save lives, and I've lived in a society where silence can take lives. So the question is, why would someone like me, once assigned to an interagency tactical unit, have to stand in the middle of a street and wait for an officer to finish asserting his power before I could legally exist?" A former Homeland Security official gave a slight nod. Camille noticed, but didn't acknowledge it. She wasn't seeking approval. She only needed to place the question in the right room. And when that question echoed through a congressional chamber, a room once flooded with speeches penned by media consultants, it was her blunt honesty that rang out as the most powerful call, not for action, but for confrontation. Not everyone has a video, not everyone has a witness, not everyone has a military record to make the system check twice, and not everyone survives an encounter with power unbound by moral restraint. I lived, but how many never got to tell their story? An elderly legislator furrowed his brow, not in disagreement, but because he knew there were no longer arguments left to defend the delay of justice. Camille tilted her head slightly. "I'm not here to revisit the past. I'm here to ask, how many more slaps, how many more recordings, how many more still gazes will it take for you to believe this system is harming itself by not believing the very people it was created to protect?" When she finished, no one applauded, but no one dared look away, and in that moment, Camille proved there are words that need no amplification, no ovation, no headline, and still they make an entire chamber fall silent so it doesn't lose track of its own conscience. When the hearing ended, no one referred to Camille as a witness anymore. She didn't become the main story on the evening news. She didn't appear on talk shows, didn't accept offers to host or become the face of any movement. She returned the same way she had arrived, quietly, decisively, bringing with her nothing but a presence that the system could no longer ignore, without questioning itself. But in her withdrawal, she left behind something louder than any speech, the quiet imprint of her presence in the memories of places she had once passed through, places no one thought would remember. One of those places was the State Police Training Academy, Building B, second floor, room 214. An old room, tucked at the end of the hallway, was usually reserved for short-term sessions, internal refreshers, or specialized forums. Few were required to attend. Camille had once been there, not as an investigator, not as a faculty member. She had been invited to speak at an internal seminar on post-mission psychological impact, engaging the community after combat. No cameras were present, no live stream, and no one knew that the woman standing in front of the class with a name tag that read only CH would one day make Congress fall silent to hear her speak. That name tag, like many others, was taken down after the session, leaving a faint adhesive mark on the wall behind the lectern. No one cleaned it. No one replaced it. It simply became part of the old fixtures, something each generation of cadets saw but never noticed, until, 1 week after the congressional hearing, a new officer, cleaning the room before class, accidentally uncovered a faded pencil inscription beneath the dust behind the lectern. Don't try to be someone who enforces the law. Try to be someone whose presence makes the law unnecessary to prove. There was no signature, no name, but the young instructor, once a cadet who had happened to attend that seminar, recognized the tall, lean figure, the measured voice, the gaze that never blinked too quickly, and for the first time, he realized he had once been taught moral clarity without even knowing it. The story began to spread through the academy. People started asking, who was CH? And soon pieced it all together after watching the video, revisiting the hearing, and tracing old class rosters. The name Camille Hightower never appeared in any official teaching records, but an internal note confirmed she had been recommended by a now-retired senior officer, someone who had served with her in the Middle East. The officer had written only one line in the proposal form. She doesn't teach how to shoot, but she once kept an entire unit calm under enemy siege. If anyone needs to learn how to stay sane, it's from her. The old name plaque was reattached, not replaced, not polished, just placed exactly where it had been, over the same dusty residue from years ago. But this time, beneath it, a new line was etched. Hightower, the one who teaches without speaking. Riley, now a young instructor himself, assigned to lead ethics orientation for first-year cadets, stood before the class, looked at the plaque, and told not the whole story, but a small part. He didn't mention the video, didn't speak of the hearing, didn't bring up Delroy. He simply said, I used to be a patrol cop, and I stayed silent when I shouldn't have. A woman once stood in the street, did nothing, but made me realize what responsibility looks like when it doesn't require a command. The cadets sat in stillness. No one took notes. No one raised a hand, but their eyes never left the old plaque, as if reading a piece of history not found in their textbooks, but etched through time, through silence, through the gaze of those who had faced injustice not to win, but to prove that sometimes standing firm is a form of action. The old name plaque was put back in place without a ceremony. No ribbon cutting, no commemorative event, no reporters waiting outside the academy gates. Yet the new cadets, descendants of those who had once heard Camille's name through a headline, a clip, or a textbook quote, began referring to her most strangely. Who is she? And the answer, no one ever said aloud, but everyone understood. They didn't need to know her full name. They just needed to remember something she left behind. Camille never returned to the academy. Not once. She didn't speak up when her name was added to a pilot ethics course, didn't show up at policy conferences, didn't become the face of any advocacy group. She disappeared from the media as naturally as a gust of wind that leaves behind a shifted landscape. And yet the name Hightower, not because it appeared often, but because it no longer needed to, became a silent gauge. If you held power and hesitated before making a decision, you would ask yourself, if Camille were standing here, would I dare do this? And if you were someone enduring injustice, unsure of what to say, unsure if silence would be misunderstood, you would remind yourself, standing still is not surrender. It's a way to see who trembles in front of what they've done. At a small university in the South, where a student was once denied protection for questioning a local officer, a group of students created a wall of sticky notes. On it, there were no slogans, no mention of Camille, just hundreds of small handwritten notes, each sharing a moment of silent defiance. I didn't lower my head when they mispronounced my name. I didn't explain myself when they assumed I was wrong, just for being different. I stood still, so they could see I wasn't small. At the top, in black ink, was one hand-lettered line, "You don't need a name to make an impact." Camille didn't send thanks to the group, but in a community night class where she now taught emergency coordination skills to immigrant women, one student asked, "Are you the woman from that video?" Camille didn't confirm, She simply looked the woman in the eye and asked back, "If I am, would it make you stand straighter?" The woman smiled. "I have already stood. You don't need to be anyone for me to know what strength looks like." In another city, a newly inaugurated government building featured a main chamber with vintage wooden seating. On the third row, among metal nameplates reading Robertson Lopez Grant, was an unmarked indentation. No nameplate, no logo, just a preserved notch with a single handwritten line beneath it. "This seat belongs to the one who reminds us why we're here." No explanation was necessary. Those who had done wrong saw the space and understood. Those trying to do right saw the space and knew it was enough. Delroy was no longer on the force. He didn't resign, but no new assignments came his way. No termination letter was issued. Yet he understood. A system doesn't keep those it must shield instead of being illuminated by. He left on a quiet afternoon. No farewell, no forms filed. But when he stopped for gas along the highway, he saw a black man in a delivery uniform helping an elderly woman lift a box of water into her car. Delroy stepped forward, intending to say thank you. But the man spoke first. "Don't say anything. We learn from those who never needed their names spoken to teach what mattered." Delroy understood. As for Camille, the woman once pulled over for not fitting the setting, the one Congress listened to without her standing behind a podium, the one who brought an officer to his knees with silence, now lived in a small western town, where she taught children how to give first aid, how to find direction in the woods, and how to stand still when you know you're right. But the world isn't ready to listen. No one asked for her full name anymore. On her class roster, they simply wrote, Miss C, and in the stories passed from one youth to another, they say to each other when forced to choose between silence and speech, "Do what she did. Stand there. Don't ask permission. Don't step back. You don't need a name to make an impact, just the courage to know who you are." The story you just heard isn't just a slice of reality, it's a reflection of what we've seen, lived, and sometimes stayed silent about because we believed we were too small, until someone, through an act that seemed ordinary, made society stop and think. If you've read this far, it means you carry something within you, a memory unspoken, a story untold. And we, those who create these narratives, don't tell them just for you to hear. We tell them so you can find yourself in every character, every moment. Leave a comment, even just a line. It can be your thoughts, an experience you've had, or simply a name you don't want the world to forget. Because through those shares, we find reasons to keep going, to write more, to tell more, to keep what must be heard from fading into silence. Don't forget to hit like if something in your heart was stirred. Share this video with someone who might need a reason to stand. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, not for the algorithm, but because we believe that positive energy needs to be nurtured, piece by people brave enough to face the truth.